Lady Cordelia Ashworth had danced with every eligible gentleman in London, except the one whose brooding gaze followed her across every ballroom. The Duke of Ravenshollow watched from the shadows as she waltzed with lords and viscounts, her emerald gown swirling to melodies that seemed chosen at random. What she did not know was that Sebastian had been studying her every smile, cataloguing her preferences, memorizing the way her eyes lit up whenever the orchestra played Mozart. Tonight, he would ensure they played nothing else. For a man who had never spoken a word to her, he was about to declare his love in the only language that mattered. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. Lady Cordelia. Ashworth pressed her gloved hand against the cool marble pillar at the edge of Lady Pemberton's ballroom, watching the kaleidoscope of silk and satin swirl before her in perfect choreographed harmony. The chandeliers cast dancing shadows across the polished floor, their crystal teardrops catching the light like captured starlight, while the scent of hothouse roses and expensive perfumes created an intoxicating cloud that should have made her feel dizzy with excitement. Instead, she felt as though she were observing the festivities through thick glass, present in body but somehow removed from the joy that seemed to animate everyone else. Her emerald silk gown, chosen specifically to complement her dark hair and bring out the green flecks in her hazel eyes, had drawn compliments from no fewer than 7 gentlemen this evening, yet she found herself caring little for their practiced flattery. Lord Marcus Pemberton approached with his characteristic confident stride, his fair hair perfectly styled, and his blue eyes twinkling with the kind of charm that had made him the darling of every drawing-room in Mayfair. "My dear Lady Cordelia," he said, executing a bow that managed to be both respectful and slightly theatrical. "I do believe this next set is mine, unless you have forgotten our earlier arrangement." She had not forgotten, though she wished she could claim a sudden bout of amnesia to avoid another tedious conversation about his latest acquisition of horseflesh or his opinions on the cut of his new coat from Weston. "How could I forget such a privilege, Lord Marcus?" she replied with a smile that felt as brittle as autumn leaves, though she noticed her gaze drifting involuntarily toward the far corner of the ballroom where a tall figure in black evening clothes stood in the shadows like a dark sentinel. Sebastian Blackwood, Duke of Ravenshollow, possessed the kind of presence that commanded attention even when he clearly sought to avoid it, his broad shoulders and commanding height making him impossible to ignore despite his obvious preference for the periphery of social gatherings. She had been aware of his attendance at every major event of the season, yet he had never once approached her for a dance, never requested an introduction through mutual acquaintances, never even acknowledged her existence beyond the occasional measured glance that she caught from the corner of her eye. As Lord Marcus led her on to the dance floor, chattering about the excellent quality of Lady Pemberton's champagne and the superior acoustics of the ballroom, Cordelia found herself wondering what thoughts occupied the Duke's mind as he watched the proceedings with those penetrating grey eyes that seemed to see everything and reveal nothing. The orchestra, positioned on a raised dais decorated with cascades of white roses and trailing ivy, began the opening notes of Mozart's waltz in a minor, and Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat as the familiar melody washed over her like a beloved friend's embrace. This piece held special meaning for her, its haunting beauty and complex harmonies speaking to something deep in her soul that she had never been able to adequately express in words. And she could not help the genuine smile that transformed her features as the music swelled around them. "Oh, how I adore this particular waltz," she said to Lord Marcus as they began to move in time with the rhythm, feeling for the first time that evening a spark of authentic pleasure. There is something about Mozart's composition that speaks directly to the heart, do you not think? Lord Marcus nodded absently, his attention more focused on executing the steps with proper form than on appreciating the musical intricacies she found so captivating. "Yes, quite pleasant," he agreed with the kind of dismissive politeness that suggested he had not truly heard her words. "Though I must say, these foreign composers do tend toward the overly sentimental, do they not? I prefer something with more vigor, more English sensibility." Cordelia felt her smile falter slightly at his casual dismissal of the music that moved her so deeply, but she maintained her composure as they continued through the familiar patterns of the dance, her feet moving automatically while her mind wandered to thoughts of what it might be like to dance with someone who shared her passion for music's emotional complexity. From his position near the card-room entrance, Sebastian watched every graceful movement she made, memorizing the way the candlelight caught in her dark hair and the manner in which her face had transformed when the Mozart began, as though she had suddenly come alive in a way that her polite social mask never allowed. He had been studying her preferences for weeks now, noting her visible responses to different musical selections, observing which pieces made her eyes close briefly in appreciation and which left her looking merely polite, cataloguing every small reaction as though he were a scholar documenting a rare and precious phenomenon. The waltz she was dancing now held particular significance, though she could never know that the same melody had once filled his nursery through a delicate music box, a final gift from his dying mother that had been brutally destroyed by his father in one of his rages, leaving young Sebastian with nothing but the haunting memory of those sweet notes and his mother's gentle voice humming along. Watching Cordelia's obvious joy in the music felt like witnessing a resurrection of something beautiful he had thought lost forever. Yet the very intensity of his reaction confirmed his deepest fear that he was utterly unworthy of approaching someone so pure and joyful with his own darkness and damaged soul. Sebastian retreated deeper into the shadows of the card-room, his hands clenched into fists as he struggled to master the emotions that threatened to overwhelm his carefully maintained composure. The sight of Cordelia dancing with yet another shallow suitor, her radiant smile wasted on someone who could not appreciate the depth of feeling she revealed through her response to the music, created a physical ache in his chest that he found both foreign and deeply disturbing. He had built his life around the principle of emotional control, learning from his brutal father that feelings were weaknesses to be crushed rather than indulged. Yet this slip of a girl with her love of Mozart and her unconscious grace had shattered his defenses without even speaking to him. Lord Edmund Fairfax, his closest friend since their days at Eton, approached with 2 glasses of brandy and the expression of a man preparing to deliver an unwelcome but necessary truth. "You cannot continue this torment indefinitely, Sebastian," Edmund said quietly, settling beside him in the alcove where they could observe the ballroom while maintaining their privacy. "Your obsession with Lady Cordelia has become painfully obvious to anyone who cares to look, and your refusal to act upon your feelings serves no purpose beyond your own suffering." Sebastian accepted the brandy but did not drink, his attention still focused on the dancing couples where Cordelia moved through the steps with unconscious elegance while her partner droned on about something that clearly bored her. "You speak of things you do not understand, Edmund," he replied, his voice carrying the cold precision he used to end unwanted conversations. "My interest in Lady Cordelia is purely observational, nothing more." Edmund laughed, a sound devoid of humor. "Observational, you call it, when you attend every social gathering she graces, position yourself where you can watch her throughout the evening, and look as though someone has died when she smiles at another man. If this is mere observation, then I am the Prince Regent." The comparison drew a reluctant smile from Sebastian, despite his inner turmoil. "She deserves better than what I could offer her," he said finally. the words feeling like broken glass in his throat. My father saw to that when he spent years ensuring I understood that love was nothing but weakness and sentiment, a luxury no true gentleman could afford. What could I possibly say to someone like her, Edmund, someone who finds joy in music and laughter when I have spent 32 years learning to feel nothing at all? His friend studied him with the kind of penetrating gaze that had made Edmund successful in both business and politics. Perhaps, Sebastian, you underestimate both yourself and her. Lady Cordelia strikes me as a woman of unusual depth and intelligence, not some silly chit who would be impressed by empty compliments and shallow charm. The very qualities you see as deficiencies in yourself might be precisely what she seeks in a partner: authenticity rather than performance, substance rather than style. As if summoned by their conversation, Cordelia appeared in the card-room doorway, her cheeks flushed from dancing and her eyes bright with the exhilaration of the waltz, though Sebastian noticed she seemed to be seeking respite from the ballroom's overwhelming social demands rather than additional company. She moved to the windows that overlooked Lady Pemberton's garden, apparently unaware of their presence in the shadowed alcove, and stood silently gazing out at the moonlit landscape, with an expression of such wistful longing that Sebastian felt his heart constrict with the desire to comfort her. "I sometimes wonder," she said softly to her sister Beatrice, who had followed her into the relative quiet of the card-room, "whether any of these gentlemen see me as anything more than an appropriate ornament for their arm and a suitable mother for their heirs. Their conversations never venture beyond the weather, the latest gossip, and their own accomplishments, as though they believe women incapable of discussing anything more substantial than fashion and social arrangements." Beatrice, a practical woman who had married for affection rather than passion, and seemed content with her choice, placed a comforting hand on her younger sister's shoulder. "You are perhaps too particular in your requirements, dearest. Lord Marcus seems genuinely fond of you, and his prospects are excellent. A comfortable marriage built on mutual respect and shared social position has much to recommend it over the uncertain storms of romantic attachment." Cordelia turned from the window with a sigh that seemed to carry the weight of unfulfilled dreams. "But is that truly enough, Beatrice? To spend one's entire life in polite conversation about nothing, to share a bed and a name with someone who has never once asked about my thoughts or dreams or fears. When I hear music like tonight's waltz, I feel as though my soul wants to soar, and I long to share that feeling with someone who understands the language of emotion rather than merely the vocabulary of social obligation. I want to love and be loved for who I am rather than what I represent, and I begin to fear that such a connection may be nothing more than a girlish fantasy." Sebastian felt Edmund's eyes upon him during this revelation, and he knew his friend was silently urging him to step forward and reveal himself to the woman whose deepest desires seemed to mirror his own hidden longings. Yet his feet remained frozen as though rooted to the floor by years of conditioning that had taught him to expect disappointment and rejection rather than acceptance and love. The memory struck him with the force of a physical blow, transporting him instantly from the sophisticated elegance of Lady Pemberton's card-room to the cold marble floors of Ravenshollow Castle, where a 7-year-old boy had knelt beside the shattered remains of his most treasured possession. His mother had given him the music box just weeks before her death, her pale hands trembling as she wound the delicate mechanism and released the sweet strains of Mozart's Waltz in a Minor into the nursery's stifling silence. "It will remind you that beauty exists in the world, Sebastian," she had whispered with the fragile voice of someone whose life was ebbing away like water through cupped hands. "And whenever you hear this melody, you must remember that love is the only force strong enough to triumph over darkness and cruelty." He had treasured that music box with the desperate intensity of a child who had lost everything else that mattered, winding it every night before sleep and allowing the familiar melody to chase away the nightmares that plagued him after his mother's funeral. His father, the fourth Duke, had discovered this nightly ritual during one of his inspection tours of the nursery, his face contorting with the kind of rage that had made him feared throughout the county and beyond. "Sentiment makes men weak," he had roared, snatching the delicate wooden box from Sebastian's protective grasp and hurling it against the stone hearth, where it exploded into splinters and twisted metal springs. "Your mother filled your head with nonsense about love and beauty, but I will teach you the truth that strength comes from crushing such foolishness before it can poison your character as it poisoned hers." The destruction of the music box had been followed by years of deliberate emotional brutality. Lessons designed to teach young Sebastian that feelings were dangerous weaknesses that must be eliminated rather than indulged, that love was a luxury no true aristocrat could afford, and that duty and cold calculation must govern every decision if one hoped to survive in a world that showed no mercy to the vulnerable. Yet despite his father's thorough education in emotional suppression, Sebastian had never been able to completely silence the echo of his mother's voice, or forget the way that Mozart waltz had once made him feel safe and cherished, and connected to something larger than his own small existence. Now, watching Cordelia's face transform with joy whenever that same melody filled a ballroom, he felt the carefully constructed walls around his heart beginning to crack with the force of recognition and longing. She embodied everything his mother had tried to teach him about beauty and love before his father's cruelty had crushed those lessons beneath the weight of harsh reality, and the knowledge that he could never approach her without contaminating her joy with his own darkness felt like experiencing that childhood loss all over again. As the evening progressed, and he observed Cordelia dancing with an endless succession of partners, each man receiving the gift of her attention, while Sebastian remained frozen in the shadows like a Gothic spectre haunting the edges of a celebration, he began to understand that his inability to act stemmed not from mere shyness or social awkwardness, but from a deep-seated belief that he was fundamentally unworthy of the kind of pure happiness she represented. The music box his father had destroyed had been more than a simple toy. It had been a symbol of his connection to love and beauty and hope, and its loss had taught him that such precious things were inevitably taken away from those foolish enough to cherish them. Yet as Cordelia moved through the ballroom like living music, her very presence seemed to suggest that perhaps his father's lessons had been wrong, that beauty and joy were not weaknesses to be crushed, but strengths to be celebrated, and that love might indeed possess the power to heal even the deepest wounds if one could find the courage to believe in its transformative magic. The waltz ended, and Sebastian watched as Cordelia curtsied to her partner before scanning the room with eyes that seemed to be searching for something or someone she could not find. And in that moment of unguarded vulnerability, he caught a glimpse of a loneliness that matched his own, and felt the first stirring of hope that perhaps, despite everything his father had taught him about his own unworthiness, there might be a way to bridge the impossible distance between them through the universal language of music that had once connected him to his mother's love and now called to him through Cordelia's unconscious grace. The morning sun filtered through the tall windows of Sebastian's study at Blackwood House, casting long shadows across the mahogany desk where he sat composing what might well be the most unusual business correspondence of his lifetime. His hand hesitated above the parchment as he considered the audacity of what he was contemplating, yet the memory of Cordelia's radiant face during the previous evening's waltz compelled him forward with a determination that surprised him with its intensity. He had spent the sleepless hours since Lady Pemberton's ball wrestling with the impossibility of his situation, torn between his desperate desire to somehow connect with the woman who had unknowingly awakened feelings he had thought buried forever, and his deep-seated conviction that his damaged soul had nothing worthy to offer someone so pure and joyful. The solution, when it came to him in the grey pre-dawn hours, was both brilliant and mad in equal measure, a way to speak to Cordelia in the only language that seemed to touch her heart, while maintaining the safe distance that his cowardice demanded. Mr. Giuseppe Moratini, the Italian maestro who conducted the orchestra for London's most prestigious social events, maintained a modest studio in Piccadilly where he gave lessons to the daughters of the ton and rehearsed his musicians for their evening performances. Sebastian had made inquiries through his valet and learned that the maestro was a man of artistic temperament but practical considerations, someone who might be persuaded to accommodate an unusual request if the compensation proved sufficiently generous. The carriage ride to Moratini's studio felt like a journey into uncharted territory, each turn of the wheels carrying Sebastian further from the safe, predictable world he had constructed around his emotional isolation, and closer to a precipice that both terrified and exhilarated him in ways he had never experienced. When he finally stood before the maestro's door, his heart was beating with the irregular rhythm of a man about to commit an act of either supreme romantic courage or complete lunacy, and he found himself questioning whether the distinction between the two had any practical significance. Giuseppe Moratini proved to be a small, energetic man with expressive dark eyes and the kind of theatrical gestures that suggested a lifetime spent in pursuit of artistic perfection. And when Sebastian explained that he wished to engage the maestro's services for Lady Whitmore's upcoming grand soirée, the musician's face lit with the enthusiasm of someone who appreciated both generous patronage and the opportunity to showcase his talents before London's elite. "Your Grace honours me with such a commission," Moratini said, his accented English flowing with the musical cadence of his native language. "Lady Whitmore's soirees are renowned throughout the city, and to conduct for such an audience would bring great pleasure to my musicians and myself. What particular selections would you wish us to perform to complement the evening's festivities?" Sebastian had rehearsed this moment during his carriage ride, yet when the time came to voice his extraordinary request, the words felt strange and dangerous on his tongue, as though speaking them aloud might somehow make his obsession with Cordelia visible to the entire world. "I have developed a particular interest in the effects of musical repetition on social behavior," he said, adopting the tone of academic inquiry that had served him well in business negotiations. "For scientific purposes, I would like your orchestra to perform only one piece throughout the entire evening. Mozart's Waltz in A minor, varied perhaps in tempo and arrangement, but maintaining the same basic melodic structure. I am prepared to compensate you and your musicians handsomely for what I realize is an unconventional request." The maestro's eyebrows rose in surprise, but Sebastian detected a gleam of curiosity rather than dismissal in the musician's expression. "Most interesting, Your Grace. This waltz, it is a beautiful piece, full of emotional complexity that reveals new facets with each hearing. But surely the guests will grow weary of the same melody repeated throughout an entire evening's entertainment." "That is precisely what I hope to study," Sebastian replied smoothly, producing a bank draft that made Moratini's eyes widen with appreciation. The way different individuals respond to musical familiarity versus novelty, the point at which pleasure becomes irritation, the manner in which repeated exposure to beauty affects human behavior. I trust I can rely upon your discretion in this matter, as well as your artistry in making each repetition seem fresh and engaging." Moratini studied the bank draft with the expression of a man calculating how many months of comfortable living it represented, then nodded with the decisive gesture of someone who had made up his mind to embrace an adventure. "Your Grace, for such generous patronage, my orchestra and I would gladly perform the same waltz from sunset to sunrise. We shall make Mozart's music sing with such beauty that even the most critical listener will find new wonders in each repetition. Meanwhile, across Mayfair, in the elegant morning room of Ashworth House, Cordelia sat at her writing desk, attempting to compose thank-you notes for the previous evening's dance partners, while struggling with a growing sense of dissatisfaction that seemed to deepen with each social gathering she attended. The stack of calling cards beside her elbow represented the cream of London's eligible bachelors, yet reviewing their names brought no flutter of excitement or anticipation, only a weary resignation that felt far too mature for her 24 years. Lord Marcus Pemberton's card lay at the top of the pile, embossed with his family crest, and bearing a message expressing his hope that she had enjoyed their waltz and his intention to call upon her that very afternoon, and Cordelia found herself dreading the prospect of another conversation about his hunting exploits and his opinions on the proper training of yep horses. She had begun to feel like an actress trapped in a performance that never varied, playing the role of the interested and eligible young lady, while her true self remained hidden behind a mask of social propriety that grew more suffocating with each passing day. The sound of footsteps in the corridor announced the arrival of her sister Beatrice, whose marriage to the sensible but unromantic Lord Whitfield had provided her with both security and respectability, while leaving her free to offer advice to her younger, still unattached sister on matters of the heart. Beatrice entered the morning room with the brisk efficiency that characterized all her movements, settling herself in the chair opposite Cordelia's desk with the air of someone preparing to deliver a lecture. "Dearest," she began without preamble, "I have been thinking about your situation with Lord Marcus, and I believe you are allowing romantic fancies to cloud your judgment regarding an eminently suitable match. He is handsome, wealthy, well-connected, and clearly besotted with you, qualities that would make any sensible woman grateful for his attention rather than finding fault with his conversation." Cordelia set down her pen with perhaps more force than strictly necessary, her frustration finally finding voice in the safety of her sister's company. "But Beatrice, is it truly romantic fancy to desire a husband who sees me as something more than a decorative object to grace his drawing room? Lord Marcus speaks to me as though I were a beautiful but empty-headed doll, incapable of thoughts beyond fashion and gossip. Yesterday he actually explained to me how a waltz is constructed, as though I had never heard music before in my life, and when I mentioned my enjoyment of Shakespeare, he patted my hand and suggested that ladies should not trouble themselves with such weighty matters when there are so many pleasant novels available for feminine consumption." Beatrice's expression softened slightly, though her pragmatic nature remained evident in her response. "I understand your desire for intellectual companionship, Cordelia, but you must remember that marriage among our class is primarily a practical arrangement designed to benefit both families involved. Affection may develop over time, and respect is certainly desirable, but the grand passion you seem to seek exists mainly in novels and poetry rather than in the reality of daily domestic life. Would it not be better to secure your future with a kind man who can provide for you generously rather than waiting for some impossible romantic ideal that may never materialize?" The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of their father's butler, who announced that Lord Marcus himself awaited them in the drawing-room, having arrived earlier than expected for his promised call, and Cordelia felt her heart sink at the prospect of enduring another hour of stilted conversation about subjects that held no interest for either of them. Lady Whitmore's grand soirée promised to be the pinnacle of the social season, with invitations coveted by everyone of consequence, and the hostess herself sparing no expense in creating an atmosphere of unparalleled elegance and refinement. The ballroom of Whitmore House had been transformed into a veritable fairy tale setting, with thousands of white roses cascading from crystal chandeliers and mirrors positioned to multiply the candlelight into a dazzling display that made every surface sparkle like captured starlight. Cordelia arrived with her family in a gown of sapphire silk that brought out the blue undertones in her dark hair, and she felt a familiar mixture of anticipation and resignation as she prepared to navigate another evening of social obligations and meaningless pleasantries. The first sign that something unusual was afoot came when the orchestra began their opening selection, and the familiar strains of Mozart's Waltz in a Minor filled the ballroom, causing Cordelia's face to brighten with genuine pleasure at hearing her beloved piece. Lord Marcus, resplendent in his evening clothes and clearly determined to claim as many dances as propriety would allow, appeared at her side almost immediately with his practiced smile and confident bearing. "My dear Lady Cordelia," he said, executing his customary bow, "what a delightful coincidence that they should begin the evening with such a charming waltz. Shall we take our place among the dancers and show these other couples how the thing should be done properly?" She accepted his offered arm and allowed him to lead her onto the floor, her movements automatically falling into the familiar patterns of the dance, while her soul soared with the music that seemed to speak directly to her heart, and for several minutes she lost herself in the pure joy of moving to Mozart's exquisite melody. Yet as the waltz concluded, and couples began to shift and rearrange themselves for the next set, something extraordinary occurred that made Cordelia wonder if she had somehow misheard the announcement. The orchestra, instead of transitioning to a different piece as custom demanded, began once again the opening measures of the same Mozart waltz, and while other dancers exchanged puzzled glances and began to murmur among themselves about the apparent mistake, Cordelia felt a thrill of delight that bordered on the magical. "How wonderful!" she exclaimed to Lord Marcus as they prepared to begin the dance anew. "They are playing my favorite piece again. Perhaps the conductor knows that true beauty deserves repetition rather than being rushed aside for the sake of mere variety." Lord Marcus looked considerably less enthusiastic about the musical repetition, his expression suggesting that he found the deviation from normal ballroom protocol both puzzling and slightly annoying. "I suppose it is pleasant enough," he replied with the diplomatic tone of someone attempting to mask his irritation, "though one does wonder whether the musicians have perhaps become confused about their program for the evening. Surely after this set, they will move on to something with a bit more spirit and variety." But as the evening progressed, and the orchestra continued to play nothing but variations on Mozart's Waltz in a Minor, sometimes slower and more romantic, sometimes faster and more lively, but always recognizably the same beloved melody, Cordelia found herself transported into a state of pure bliss that made every dance feel like a gift from heaven itself. She moved through the familiar figures with a grace and joy that drew admiring glances from observers around the ballroom, her face radiant with happiness and her entire being seeming to glow with an inner light that transformed her from merely pretty to absolutely luminous. Other ladies began to express their displeasure with increasing volume and clarity as the evening wore on, their voices carrying across the ballroom in complaints about the tedious repetition and demands that someone explain the orchestra's bizarre behavior. Lady Pemberton declared loudly that she had never encountered such poor planning at a society event, while Lady Harrington suggested that perhaps the musicians had been overserved with wine before beginning their performance. Even Lady Whitmore herself appeared increasingly distressed as she moved through the crowd, attempting to manage what was clearly becoming a social crisis of unprecedented proportions. Yet through all the growing discontent and whispered criticism, Cordelia remained blissfully unaware of the controversy swirling around her, completely absorbed in the music that seemed to have been chosen specifically for her enjoyment. When Lord Marcus finally voiced his own frustration during their fourth consecutive waltz to the same melody, his complaints fell upon ears that heard only ingratitude where he heard reasonable objection. "Really, Lady Cordelia," he said as they moved through the familiar steps yet again. "This musical situation has become quite ridiculous. How can anyone be expected to enjoy dancing when the orchestra insists upon playing the same tedious tune over and over without variation or relief? Surely even you must admit that variety is the spice of life, and this endless repetition grows more tiresome with each passing moment." Cordelia's response surprised him with its passionate intensity, her eyes flashing with a fire he had never seen in her normally composed demeanor. "Tedious, my lord," she said, her voice carrying a conviction that made several nearby couples turn to observe their conversation. "This is Mozart at his most sublime, music that reveals new beauties and complexities with each hearing for those who possess the sensitivity to appreciate such artistry. Each repetition is like viewing a masterpiece painting from a different angle, discovering details and emotional nuances that were hidden during previous encounters. How can you call such magnificent composition tedious when it speaks to the very essence of human emotion and transcends the mundane concerns of ordinary existence?" The passion in her voice caught the attention of several listeners, including Sebastian, who had positioned himself near a pillar where he could observe her reactions without drawing attention to his own intense focus on her every movement and expression. The morning after Lady Whitmore's extraordinary soirée brought a flood of speculation and gossip that spread through London's drawing rooms like wildfire, with every household that mattered buzzing with theories about the unprecedented musical anomaly that had transformed what should have been a standard social gathering into the most talked-about event of the season. Tea tables across Mayfair groaned under the weight of calling cards and visiting ladies eager to dissect every detail of the previous evening's mystery, while gentlemen's clubs echoed with heated debates about whether the orchestra's behavior represented artistic vision or simple incompetence. Mrs. Evangeline Whitmore, the evening's beleaguered hostess, found herself in the uncomfortable position of fielding endless questions about a situation she genuinely did not understand, her usual social confidence shaken by the realization that her carefully planned soirée would be remembered not for its elegance, but for its musical eccentricity. Lady Pemberton, never one to miss an opportunity for dramatic pronouncement, declared over morning tea at Lady Harrington's that she had never witnessed such poor management of an evening's entertainment, while Lady Harrington countered that perhaps there had been some deeper purpose behind the repetition that mere mortals were too obtuse to comprehend. The speculation ranged from the practical to the fantastical, with theories encompassing everything from a wager between gentlemen about the effects of musical monotony to the possibility that one of the orchestra members had suffered some form of mental breakdown that prevented him from remembering any other pieces. Mrs. Whitmore, desperate to salvage her reputation as a hostess, sent her butler to question the servants who had been present during the evening, hoping to uncover some explanation that would allow her to deflect blame for the musical disaster that had overshadowed what should have been her social triumph. Meanwhile, at Ashworth House, Theodore Ashworth, Earl of Ashworth, paced the length of his study with the restless energy of a man confronting a mystery that might threaten his family's welfare in ways he could not yet fully comprehend. His years of experience in London society had taught him to recognize the difference between coincidence and deliberate action, and something about the previous evening's events struck him as too precisely targeted to be mere happenstance. The fact that his daughter Cordelia had been the only person present who seemed genuinely delighted by the musical repetition created an uncomfortable suspicion that someone had orchestrated the entire affair specifically for her benefit, and the implications of such focused attention from an unknown admirer filled him with paternal concern that bordered on genuine alarm. His investigation began with a careful review of the guest list, searching for anyone whose behavior toward Cordelia might have seemed unusual or whose interest in his daughter exceeded the bounds of normal social courtesy. Yet the exercise proved frustratingly inconclusive, since virtually every unmarried gentleman present had requested at least one dance, with the acknowledged belle of the season. He dispatched his secretary to make discreet inquiries about the orchestra's hiring and payment, hoping to trace any unusual financial arrangements that might point toward the identity of whoever had commissioned such an extraordinary evening of entertainment, though he suspected that anyone clever enough to orchestrate such an elaborate scheme would be equally clever about covering their tracks. The Earl's concerns were not entirely unfounded, as several other fathers had begun to notice the marked attention their daughters received from mysterious admirers whose identities remained frustratingly elusive. And the possibility that some unknown gentleman was using unconventional methods to court eligible young ladies created a ripple of unease through the ranks of parents who prided themselves on maintaining strict control over their daughters' romantic prospects. Sebastian, meanwhile, found himself torn between triumph and terror as he observed the effects of his grand gesture from the safe distance of his morning room, where newspapers and correspondents brought regular reports of the speculation his musical manipulation had generated throughout London society. He had achieved his goal of bringing joy to Cordelia's face and demonstrating his understanding of her musical preferences. Yet the intensity of the investigation his actions had triggered made him acutely aware of how close he was treading to exposure and the social catastrophe that would inevitably follow if his identity as the mysterious musical patron became known. The risk of discovery weighed heavily on his mind as he considered whether to abandon his campaign before it could be traced back to him. Yet the memory of Cordelia's radiant happiness as she danced to her beloved Mozart made the prospect of retreat feel like a betrayal of everything beautiful and pure that she represented in his carefully ordered but emotionally barren existence. His internal struggle was interrupted by the arrival of Edmund Fairfax, who appeared unannounced at Blackwood House with the determined expression of a man prepared to extract confessions through whatever means proved necessary, and Sebastian realized that his friend's legendary powers of observation had likely already connected him to the previous evening's mysterious musical events. "My dear Sebastian," Edmund said without preamble, as he settled himself in the chair across from Sebastian's desk, "what an extraordinary coincidence that Lady Whitmore's orchestra should choose to play nothing but Mozart's Waltz in a Minor, the very piece that seems to bring such joy to a certain young lady whose welfare occupies so much of your attention these days. I trust you found the musical selections as surprising as everyone else who attended the soirée." Sebastian attempted to maintain his composure under his friend's penetrating gaze, though he suspected that his carefully neutral expression was fooling no one who knew him well enough to read the subtle signs of emotional turmoil that he struggled to conceal. "I found the evening's entertainment quite adequate for its purpose," he replied, with the studied calm he employed during business negotiations, though I confess myself puzzled by the conductor's choice to limit his repertoire so dramatically. Perhaps he felt that Mozart's genius deserved more thorough exploration than the typical evening's superficial sampling of various composers might allow. Edmund's knowing smile suggested that he was not deceived by this attempted deflection, and his next words confirmed Sebastian's worst fears about how transparent his involvement had become to those who knew him well. "How fascinating that you should defend such an unusual musical choice when everyone else present found it tedious beyond endurance, with the notable exception of Lady Cordelia, who appeared to be having the time of her life, dancing to the same waltz repeatedly. One might almost think that someone who knew her preferences quite well had arranged the evening's program specifically for her enjoyment, though of course such a romantic gesture would require both considerable financial resources and an intimate knowledge of her musical tastes that few gentlemen could claim to possess." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sebastian's butler, who announced that a young lady requested a word with his grace on a matter of some urgency, and both men looked up in surprise as Cordelia herself appeared in the doorway, her cheeks flushed with excitement, and her eyes bright with an emotion that made Sebastian's heart race with equal measures of hope and terror. "Your Grace," she said, dropping into a curtsy that seemed almost perfunctory in her eagerness to speak. "I hope you will forgive my impropriety in calling upon you without proper arrangement, but I simply had to thank whoever was responsible for last evening's magical musical selection, and my inquiries have suggested that you might possess information about the identity of the person who understood my soul deeply enough to provide such a gift of perfect beauty." And Sebastian's hands trembled slightly as he penned yet another carefully worded instruction to his growing network of musical conspirators, the morning light filtering through his study windows, illuminating what had become a war room of romantic strategizing that would have amazed anyone who knew him as the coldly controlled Duke of Ravenshollow. Maps of Cordelia's usual walking routes lay spread across his mahogany desk, alongside detailed notes about her daily routines, information he had gathered through the discreet inquiries of his valet, and the careful observation that had become his secret obsession. What had begun as a single evening's musical tribute had evolved into an elaborate campaign of anonymous courtship that grew more complex and dangerous with each passing day. Yet Sebastian found himself powerless to stop the escalation, despite his growing awareness that discovery would mean not only personal humiliation, but complete social ruin for them both. The street musicians he had hired proved remarkably adaptable to his unusual requests. Their leader, a grizzled violinist named Thomas Hartwell, who had spent decades performing in London's squares and marketplaces, and seemed delighted to receive generous compensation for playing specific pieces at predetermined locations along Cordelia's morning constitutional route through Hyde Park. Hartwell had assembled a small ensemble of carefully chosen performers, whose repertoire included not only Mozart's beloved waltz, but also selections from Bach, Vivaldi, and Beethoven that Sebastian had observed eliciting particular joy from Cordelia during various social gatherings, and the musicians had proven remarkably skilled at creating the appearance of coincidental street performance while actually executing a carefully choreographed musical ambush designed to surround his beloved with the sounds that made her soul sing. The rare sheet music proved an even more delicate operation, requiring Sebastian to work through antiquarian book dealers and private collectors who specialized in locating manuscripts and first editions that existed in only a handful of copies throughout Europe. Each purchase required careful negotiation and substantial payment, yet Sebastian found himself willing to spare no expense when it came to acquiring pieces that might bring Cordelia joy, from a hand-copied score of Mozart's lesser-known sonatas to an original manuscript of Bach's Goldberg variations that had taken months to locate and cost more than many families spent in an entire year. The deliveries themselves required the utmost discretion, with packages arriving at Ashworth House bearing no return address and accompanied only by cards that bore quotations from the composers themselves, messages that spoke of music's power to express the inexpressible and touch the depths of human emotion in ways that mere words could never achieve. Sebastian's anonymous gifts were crafted to demonstrate not only his willingness to spare no expense for her happiness, but also his deep understanding of her musical sophistication. Each selection chosen to challenge and delight someone whose knowledge of composition went far beyond the superficial appreciation expected of well-bred young ladies. He had observed her enough to know that she possessed genuine musical intelligence rather than mere social accomplishment, and his gifts reflected this understanding through their complexity and rarity. Pieces that would excite a true lover of music while remaining meaningless to someone who viewed musical performance as nothing more than an expected feminine accomplishment. The effect of these musical encounters on Cordelia exceeded even Sebastian's most optimistic expectations, transforming her daily walks from routine exercise into anticipated adventures that filled her with excitement and wonder at each unexpected serenade. Her family and friends began to notice a change in her demeanor, a new lightness in her step and brightness in her eyes that suggested the influence of some powerful but mysterious source of happiness. And when questioned about her improved spirits, she would only smile secretively and speak vaguely of feeling blessed by unexpected encounters with beauty in the most ordinary circumstances. The mysterious sheet music deliveries created an even more profound impact, providing Cordelia with musical treasures she had only dreamed of possessing, and demonstrating that her anonymous admirer understood not only her preferences, but also the depth of her musical knowledge and appreciation. She spent hours studying each new acquisition, her fingers tracing the intricate notations while her mind absorbed the complexities of composition that most of her social circle would have found incomprehensible, and the knowledge that someone cared enough to seek out such rare and wonderful gifts filled her with a warmth that had nothing to do with mere material generosity and everything to do with the recognition of her truest self. Yet this very success created new dangers for Sebastian, as Cordelia's growing obsession with discovering her mysterious benefactor led to increasingly pointed questions and careful observation of everyone in her social circle who might possess both the resources and knowledge necessary to orchestrate such an elaborate courtship. Her conversations at social gatherings began to include seemingly casual inquiries about various gentlemen's musical knowledge and financial resources, while her eyes searched every ballroom and drawing room for signs that might reveal the identity of someone who understood her soul deeply enough to court her in the language of music rather than conventional flowers and pretty compliments. Sebastian found himself walking an increasingly narrow line between revelation and retreat, his heart soaring each time he witnessed Cordelia's joy at receiving his gifts, while his mind calculated the growing risks of exposure that threatened to destroy not only his carefully constructed emotional defenses, but also any possibility of the genuine relationship that he desired more desperately with each passing day. The afternoon of the Ashworth garden party dawned with the kind of perfect English weather that seemed designed specifically for outdoor entertainment, with gentle breezes carrying the scent of roses across manicured lawns, while sunlight filtered through ancient oak trees to create a dappled pattern of light and shadow that transformed the ordinary world into something approaching fairy tale magic. Lady Ashworth had spared no effort in creating an atmosphere of refined elegance that would provide the perfect backdrop for society's most accomplished young people to see and be seen, while enjoying the kind of sophisticated conversation and gentle recreation that marked the pinnacle of civilized entertainment. Sebastian arrived fashionably late, his customary strategy for avoiding the crush of early arrivals while ensuring that his presence would be noted by those who mattered, though his true motivation had nothing to do with social positioning and everything to do with maximizing his opportunities to observe Cordelia in her natural element while maintaining the careful distance that his dual role as secret admirer and apparent stranger required. The hidden string quartet he had arranged proved to be his most ambitious musical venture yet, requiring careful coordination with the Ashworth household staff and the construction of a concealed performance area behind a carefully planted screen of flowering shrubs that would allow the musicians to remain invisible while projecting their sound throughout the garden's winding pathways. The leader of this ensemble, a talented young composer named William Thornfield, had proven remarkably understanding when Sebastian explained his desire to provide anonymous musical entertainment for the garden party guests, though Thornfield's knowing smile suggested that he suspected the true romantic purpose behind such an unusual commission. The pieces Sebastian had selected for this performance represented the culmination of weeks of observation and study, including not only Cordelia's beloved Mozart waltz, but also selections from Handel's water music that he had seen bring tears of joy to her eyes during a recent concert, and a haunting melody by Purcell that seemed to embody the wistful longing he had observed in her expression during quiet moments when she thought herself unobserved. As the afternoon progressed and guests wandered through the carefully planned landscape of formal flower beds and shaded groves, Sebastian positioned himself with strategic precision to observe Cordelia's progress through the garden while appearing to engage in casual conversation with other attendees who viewed his presence as an unexpected social triumph for their hostess. The moment the hidden quartet began their first selection, Sebastian watched Cordelia's face transform with the now familiar expression of wonder and delight that had become as necessary to his happiness as breathing itself, her steps slowing as she listened to music that seemed to emerge from the very flowers and trees around her like some supernatural manifestation of beauty made audible. She moved through the garden pathways with the dreamlike grace of someone under an enchantment, her silk gown the color of spring lavender rustling softly as she followed the sound of music that seemed to shift and change location, as though the invisible musicians were leading her on some mystical journey through a landscape designed specifically for her pleasure. Sebastian shadowed her progress from a careful distance, his heart racing with the intoxicating combination of triumph and terror that had become the dominant emotion of his carefully orchestrated campaign. Watching as she paused beside fountain and rose arbor to listen more closely to melodies that spoke directly to her soul in ways that he could never hope to achieve through conventional conversation. When the quartet began the Purcell selection, Sebastian saw tears gather in Cordelia's eyes as she stood perfectly still in a shaft of golden sunlight, her entire being focused on music that seemed to express everything beautiful and tragic and hopeful about human existence. And in that moment, he felt such overwhelming love for her that he thought his heart might actually burst from the intensity of emotion that no amount of his father's brutal conditioning had been able to completely destroy. The spell was broken when Cordelia turned suddenly around a corner of the path and nearly collided with Sebastian himself, who had been so absorbed in observing her reaction to his musical gift that he had failed to maintain his usual, careful distance. And suddenly they stood face to face in the dappled sunlight, with music floating around them like invisible silk, and nothing but a few feet of garden path separating them from a conversation that might change everything or destroy all his carefully constructed anonymity. "Your Grace," she said, her voice breathless from surprise and perhaps from the emotional impact of the music that still swelled around them. "I did not expect to encounter you in such a secluded corner of the garden. Are you perhaps also seeking respite from the crowd? Or have you too been following the sound of this extraordinary music that seems to emerge from the very air itself?" Sebastian felt his prepared social responses desert him entirely as he looked into eyes that still sparkled with unshed tears of musical joy, her proximity and the intimate setting combining to create a moment of connection that bypassed all his careful defenses and spoke directly to the part of his soul that had been starved for genuine human contact since childhood. "I confess that the music drew me here as well, Lady Cordelia," he replied, his voice carrying a sincerity that surprised him with its intensity. "There is something about such beauty that makes conventional social conversation seem inadequate. Is there not? Music has always possessed the power to express truths that mere words cannot capture, to touch parts of the human spirit that remain locked away during ordinary discourse." Her face lit with the kind of genuine enthusiasm he had only observed from a distance. And suddenly they were no longer Duke and Earl's daughter maintaining proper social distance, but simply two people who had discovered a shared passion that transcended the artificial barriers of rank and convention. "Oh, how perfectly you express what I have always felt but struggled to articulate," she said, her hands clasping together in a gesture of excitement that was entirely unconscious and utterly charming. So few people understand that music is not merely entertainment, but rather a language of emotion that speaks directly to the soul, revealing truths about beauty and longing and hope that ordinary conversation can never approach. Do you find, as I do, that certain pieces seem to unlock memories and feelings that you did not even know existed within yourself? Sebastian found himself caught in the dangerous current of genuine conversation with the woman he had been observing and courting from afar, her words awakening responses that had nothing to do with his carefully planned romantic strategy and everything to do with the fundamental connection between two souls who had found unexpected recognition in each other's understanding of what truly mattered in life. The musical enchantment that had surrounded their garden encounter was shattered 3 days later, when Lord Marcus Pemberton chose the most public possible moment to make an announcement that sent shockwaves through the assembled company at Mrs. Whitmore's afternoon tea and left Cordelia reeling with a combination of disappointment and confusion that she struggled to conceal behind her well-trained social mask. The drawing-room at Whitmore House buzzed with the usual mixture of gossip and speculation that characterized such gatherings, with ladies positioned strategically around small tables laden with delicate china and elaborate pastries, while they dissected the latest romantic developments and social scandals with the precision of military strategists planning a campaign. Mrs. Whitmore herself, still nursing wounded pride over her musical disaster of a soirée, had been holding court near the fireplace with increasingly dramatic descriptions of her attempts to discover the identity of whoever had sabotaged her carefully planned evening with their inexplicable musical obsession, her voice rising with righteous indignation as she described the investigation that had yielded nothing but frustration and mounting social embarrassment. It was during one of these theatrical recitations that Lord Marcus suddenly rose from his position near the windows, his handsome face wearing an expression of sheepish pride that immediately drew the attention of every woman in the room, particularly those mothers whose daughters remained disappointingly unengaged despite the progress of the social season. "My dear Mrs. Whitmore," he said with the kind of dramatic flourish that suggested careful rehearsal, "I feel compelled by honor and affection to confess that the mystery which has so distressed you was entirely of my creation, though I hope you will forgive the deception when you understand that it was motivated purely by romantic devotion rather than any desire to cause you embarrassment." The silence that greeted this announcement was so complete that the ticking of the mantel clock seemed to echo through the room like thunder, and Cordelia felt her heart sink as she realized what confession was about to emerge from the lips of a man whose pursuit she had been desperately trying to discourage without causing open social offense. Mrs. Whitmore's face cycled through several expressions before settling on a mixture of relief and curiosity that suggested her primary concern was finally having someone to blame for her social humiliation rather than any particular interest in Lord Marcus's romantic motivations. "You see," he continued with growing confidence as he basked in the rapt attention of his audience, "I have been attempting to court the affections of London's most accomplished young lady through the language that speaks most clearly to her heart, and I confess that the musical tributes which have so puzzled society have all been my humble offerings to the woman who has captured my complete devotion." Lady Cordelia's passion for Mozart is well known among her admirers, and I felt that conventional flowers and pretty speeches could never adequately express the depth of my feelings for someone whose soul responds so powerfully to the beauty of music. The murmur of excitement that rippled through the assembled ladies was immediately followed by a chorus of congratulations and romantic sighs that made Cordelia want to flee from the room rather than endure another moment of what felt like a public trial rather than a romantic revelation. She found herself trapped between the social impossibility of openly contradicting Lord Marcus's claim and her own certain knowledge that he possessed neither the musical sophistication nor the financial resources necessary to orchestrate the elaborate campaign that had brought such joy to her recent days, Yet the evidence of her own confusion and the expectant faces around her made any protest seem churlish and ungrateful rather than truthful. Lord Marcus, encouraged by what he interpreted as stunned silence of romantic overwhelm rather than the actual dismay it represented, moved to kneel beside her chair in a gesture that drew delighted gasps from the assembled matrons and made escape completely impossible. "My dearest Cordelia," he said in tones that carried clearly to every corner of the drawing-room, "I hope you will forgive the unconventional nature of my courtship, but I felt that someone of your refined sensibilities deserved a more artistic approach than the crude methods employed by lesser suitors. Every street musician who has serenaded your morning walks, every rare manuscript that has found its way to your door, every moment of musical magic that has brightened your days has been my attempt to speak to your heart in the language you understand best." The words felt like physical blows to Cordelia as she realized that her wonderful anonymous admirer, the mysterious figure who had seemed to understand her soul with such perfect clarity, had been transformed in an instant into the one man whose attentions she had been struggling to discourage without causing social scandal. The magical gifts that had filled her with hope and wonder now felt tainted by the knowledge that they came from someone who had never once demonstrated genuine interest in her thoughts or feelings beyond their utility in advancing his own romantic agenda, and she found herself mourning the loss of a dream that had made even ordinary days feel touched by romance and possibility. Sebastian, positioned near the door where he had been preparing to take his leave, felt the blood drain from his face as he heard Lord Marcus claim credit for every gesture of love and understanding that had cost Sebastian not only enormous sums of money, but also sleepless nights of planning and desperate hope for connection with the woman who had awakened feelings he had thought destroyed by his father's cruelty. The casual way in which his most sincere offerings were being appropriated by a man who had contributed nothing but opportunistic lies made Sebastian's hands clench into fists as he struggled to control emotions that threatened to explode into the kind of public scene that would destroy any remaining possibility of genuine relationship with Cordelia, while exposing his own vulnerability to the mockery of people who had never understood what love could drive a man to risk. Yet even worse than the theft of credit for his gifts was the sight of Cordelia's face as she absorbed Lord Marcus's claims, her expression cycling through confusion and disappointment before settling into the polite acceptance that her social training demanded, and Sebastian realized with devastating clarity that his beloved was preparing to accept a marriage proposal from a man who was stealing Sebastian's own heart's blood while she remained completely ignorant of the deception being perpetrated in front of the entire assembled company. The evening of Lord Fairfax's masquerade ball promised to transform the ordinary constraints of London society into something altogether more magical and dangerous, where hidden identities and mysterious encounters could flourish beneath elaborate masks and flowing costumes that freed their wearers from the rigid expectations of rank and reputation that normally governed every interaction among the ton. Edmund had spared no expense in creating an atmosphere of theatrical splendor that would encourage even the most proper ladies and gentlemen to embrace the intoxicating freedom of anonymity, with the ballroom of Fairfax House draped in midnight blue silk and illuminated by hundreds of candles that cast dancing shadows perfect for concealing identities while revealing the kind of authentic connections that daylight and social convention usually prevented. Sebastian had chosen his costume with the same meticulous attention to detail that he brought to all his endeavors, selecting a black domino and half mask that would allow him to move through the crowd unrecognized while maintaining the elegant bearing that years of ducal training had made second nature, though tonight he intended to use that natural authority not to intimidate or control, but rather to finally approach the woman whose presence had become as necessary to his existence as breathing itself. The elaborate Venetian mask he wore featured intricate silver scroll work that caught the candlelight, while concealing enough of his distinctive features to render him essentially anonymous among the other mysterious figures who populated Edmund's carefully orchestrated fantasy. And for the first time in his adult life, Sebastian felt the liberating possibility of being seen for who he truly was, rather than the title and reputation that preceded him into every room he entered. Cordelia had arrived in a costume that transformed her into something between an earthly angel and a woodland fairy, her gown of shimmering gold silk catching the light with every movement, while her elaborate mask of white and gold feathers created an aura of otherworldly beauty that drew admiring glances from masked gentlemen whose identities remained tantalizingly hidden behind their own elaborate disguises. The freedom of anonymity had already begun to work its magic upon her usually reserved demeanor, allowing her to engage in conversations with mysterious strangers without the burden of social expectations that normally made every interaction a careful calculation of propriety and positioning. And she found herself genuinely enjoying the evening's festivities for the first time in months of tedious social obligations. When the orchestra began their opening selection, the familiar strains of Mozart's Waltz in A minor filled the ballroom with such perfect timing that Cordelia wondered whether every musical encounter in her recent life had been leading toward this moment of magical convergence between her deepest desires and the mysterious forces that seemed to be orchestrating her romantic destiny with increasing boldness and sophistication. Sebastian approached her through the swirling crowd of masked dancers, with his heart hammering against his ribs in a rhythm that had nothing to do with the music, and everything to do with the knowledge that he was finally about to bridge the impossible distance he had maintained between them through weeks of anonymous courtship and desperate longing. The sight of her in the golden gown that made her dark hair gleam like silk in the candlelight, combined with the knowledge that tonight their conversation could proceed without the barriers of rank and social positioning that had kept him frozen in cowardly silence, filled him with a courage that felt both foreign and utterly natural, as though he were finally becoming the man he was meant to be rather than the emotionally crippled product of his father's brutal conditioning. "Madame," he said, offering the kind of elegant bow that years of ducal training had perfected while allowing his voice to carry the warmth and sincerity that he had never dared reveal in conventional social settings. "Would you honor me with this dance? I confess that the music seems to call for a partner whose grace matches its beauty, and you appear to be the only lady present whose movements could possibly do justice to Mozart's divine composition." Her response sent a thrill through him that had nothing to do with social triumph and everything to do with the recognition of a kindred spirit. Her eyes lighting with the genuine enthusiasm he had observed from afar but never been privileged to experience directly. "How perfectly you speak of music, sir," she replied, placing her gloved hand in his with a trust that made his chest tighten with unfamiliar emotion. So few people understand that Mozart's waltzes are not mere entertainment, but rather conversations between souls who recognize beauty in its purest form. I should be delighted to dance with someone who appreciates the true artistry of such composition, rather than simply moving through the steps because social obligation demands it. As they moved on to the dance floor, and Sebastian felt her hand rest lightly upon his shoulder, while his own settled at her waist with a reverence usually reserved for sacred objects, the rest of the world seemed to fade away until nothing existed but the music that surrounded them, and the perfect synchronization of their movements that felt less like learned steps and more like the natural expression of two souls who had finally found their missing halves. Their conversation flowed with the same effortless grace as their dancing, touching upon subjects that ranged from the philosophical implications of musical beauty to their shared love of literature, and their dreams for lives that transcended the shallow pursuits that seemed to satisfy their contemporaries. And Sebastian found himself sharing thoughts and feelings that he had never voiced to another human being, while Cordelia responded with insights that revealed a depth of understanding he had only hoped existed beneath her politely reserved public persona. "Do you not find it strange?" she said as they moved through a particularly complex series of turns that required them to maintain eye contact while their bodies moved in perfect harmony, "that society expects us to choose our life partners based on such superficial considerations as wealth and social position, when the truly important questions about compatibility of mind and heart are never even explored. I have spent this entire season dancing with gentlemen who speak to me as though I were a beautiful but empty vessel designed solely to reflect their own importance, and I had begun to despair of ever finding someone who valued the contents of my thoughts more than the arrangement of my features." Her words struck Sebastian with such force that he momentarily forgot to breathe, the realization that this remarkable woman shared his own longing for authentic connection, making him feel as though every carefully constructed barrier around his heart was crumbling in the face of her unconscious honesty. "You speak my own thoughts with such perfect clarity that I wonder whether we might not be kindred spirits who have finally found each other after years of searching among people who mistake surface accomplishments for genuine substance," he replied, his voice carrying an intensity that made her eyes widen with surprise and something deeper that might have been recognition. "I have spent my entire adult life surrounded by individuals who value position over principle and wealth over wisdom, and I had begun to believe that genuine understanding between two people was nothing more than a romantic fantasy created by poets who had never experienced the disappointments of actual human relationships. Their waltz seemed to last for hours rather than minutes, each moment expanding to contain entire conversations about art and beauty and the possibility of finding true love in a world that seemed designed to prevent such miraculous connections. And when the music finally drew to its inevitable conclusion, both Sebastian and Cordelia felt as though they were awakening from the most beautiful dream either had ever experienced. Reluctant to break the spell that had transformed them from lonely individuals into two halves of a perfect whole. The stroke of midnight arrived with the inexorable finality of fate itself, bringing with it the moment that every masquerade ball guest both anticipated and dreaded, when the magical anonymity that had allowed hearts to speak freely would be stripped away to reveal the mundane realities of identity and social position that daylight society demanded. The orchestra paused in their playing as Lord Fairfax mounted the small platform that served as their stage, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly hushed ballroom as he announced the traditional unmasking that would transform mysterious strangers back into familiar faces with all their attendant social baggage and predetermined relationships. Sebastian felt his heart racing with a mixture of anticipation and terror as he realized that the perfect evening he had shared with Cordelia was about to be subjected to the harsh light of revelation, yet some part of him hoped desperately that the connection they had forged through music and conversation might prove strong enough to survive the shock of discovering each other's true identities. Around them, other couples began the ritualistic removal of their disguises with varying degrees of excitement and apprehension, some revealing pleasant surprises, while others exposed the kind of social mismatches that would provide gossip for weeks to come, and Sebastian steeled himself for whatever reaction Cordelia might have when she discovered that her perfect partner had been the very man whose presence at social gatherings she had seemed to find so unsettling during their previous encounters. When he reached up to remove his own mask, Sebastian's hands trembled slightly with the knowledge that he was about to either fulfill his deepest dreams or destroy his last hope for the kind of love he had thought beyond his reach. Yet the memory of their shared conversation about authentic connection gave him the courage to proceed with the revelation that would determine whether their magical evening had been the beginning of something beautiful or simply a cruel illusion destined to shatter under the weight of reality. The sight of his familiar features emerging from behind the silver and black mask seemed to strike Cordelia with the force of a physical blow, her face cycling through confusion, recognition, and what appeared to be profound disappointment, before settling into an expression of hurt bewilderment that made Sebastian's heart contract with pain at having caused her such obvious distress. "Your Grace," she said, her voice barely above a whisper as she took an involuntary step backward, her own mask dangling forgotten from nerveless fingers while her eyes searched his face as though looking for some explanation that might make sense of what felt like an elaborate deception rather than the romantic revelation he had hoped it might represent. "I do not understand how you could have known so perfectly what to say to touch my heart when you have never before shown the slightest interest in conversing with me beyond the most superficial social pleasantries required by common courtesy." Sebastian reached toward her with desperate urgency, his own mask falling to the floor as he attempted to bridge the growing distance between them with words that might explain the seemingly inexplicable contradiction between his previous social behavior and the intimate connection they had just shared. "Lady Cordelia, please allow me to explain that everything I said tonight was the absolute truth of my heart, that my previous reticence in your presence stemmed not from lack of interest, but rather from my own conviction that someone of your goodness and purity deserved far better than what a damaged man like myself could ever hope to offer. Every word we exchanged tonight has been building in my soul for months, waiting for an opportunity to finally speak to you without the barriers that my own fears and social conventions have erected between us." But even as he spoke, Sebastian could see that his explanations were falling upon ears that heard only betrayal where he meant devotion, and Cordelia's expression continued to harden into the kind of polite distance that he recognized as the social armor she employed when she felt threatened or deceived by those around her. "How convenient for you, Your Grace," she replied with the cutting precision that well-bred ladies employed when they wished to deliver social death by 1,000 tiny wounds, "that tonight's magical anonymity allowed you to discover exactly what romantic nonsense I might be foolish enough to reveal to a stranger, providing you with valuable intelligence about my weaknesses that you might use for whatever purpose amuses you in the future. I had thought myself speaking to a kindred spirit who understood the language of the heart, but instead I find that I have been conversing with someone who was merely conducting an experiment in feminine gullibility for his own entertainment." The accusation struck Sebastian like a physical blow, not least because he could understand how his behavior might appear deceptive to someone who had no knowledge of his months of anonymous courtship and desperate longing for exactly the kind of connection they had shared during their dance. Before he could formulate any response that might begin to convey the truth of his feelings without revealing the extent of his secret campaign on her behalf, Cordelia had turned away from him with the kind of dignified retreat that made pursuit impossible without creating the sort of public scene that would only confirm her worst suspicions about his motives and character. She moved through the crowd of still unmasking revelers with the determination of someone fleeing a nightmare, her golden gown catching the candlelight one final time before disappearing through the ballroom doors and leaving Sebastian standing alone among the celebrating couples with nothing but a delicate white glove that had fallen from her hand during her precipitous departure. The soft kid leather seemed to burn against his palm as he closed his fingers around this single tangible reminder of the most perfect and devastating evening of his entire life, while around him the sounds of laughter and music continued as though his world had not just collapsed into ruins that might never be rebuilt into anything resembling hope or happiness. The morning after the disastrous masquerade brought a renewed assault on Cordelia's peace in the form of Lord Marcus Pemberton's formal proposal. Delivered with all the pomp and ceremony that society expected from such momentous occasions, but carrying none of the emotional weight that might have made it feel like anything more than a business transaction disguised as romantic declaration. He arrived at Ashworth House with a magnificent bouquet of hothouse roses and the confident bearing of a man who had every reason to expect success, having already received the tacit approval of Cordelia's father and the enthusiastic encouragement of Mrs. Whitmore, who had taken it upon herself to orchestrate what she considered the perfect resolution to the season's most promising romantic subplot. The formal drawing-room had been prepared for the occasion with fresh flowers and the best china, while Lady Ashworth hovered nervously in the background with the expression of a woman who desperately hoped her daughter would have the good sense to accept an offer that represented everything a sensible young lady should desire in a husband, from excellent financial prospects to unimpeachable social connections that would secure her place among London's most exclusive circles. Lord Marcus himself seemed supremely confident as he launched into what was clearly a carefully rehearsed speech about his deep affection for Cordelia and his certainty that they would create a marriage based on mutual respect and shared social aspirations, though his words carried the mechanical precision of someone reciting lines rather than the passionate sincerity of a man declaring his heart's deepest feelings. "My dearest Lady Cordelia," he said, dropping to one knee beside her chair in a gesture that managed to be both theatrical and oddly perfunctory, "you must surely be aware that my attentions this season have been focused entirely upon winning your affections through the kind of romantic gestures that a lady of your refined sensibilities deserves. The musical tributes I have arranged, the rare manuscripts I have procured, every token of my devotion has been designed to demonstrate that I understand and appreciate the depth of your artistic nature in ways that lesser suitors never could. Our marriage would unite two of London's most respected families while providing you with the kind of cultured household where your love of music and literature could flourish under the protection of a husband who shares your appreciation for the finer things in life." Cordelia listened to this proposal with the sinking realization that she was being offered exactly the kind of marriage that society considered ideal, yet feeling no corresponding surge of joy or gratitude for such advantageous attention, instead finding herself comparing Lord Marcus's mechanical courtship to the magical connection she had experienced during the previous evening's waltz before the devastating revelation of her partner's true identity had shattered her dreams of finding genuine love. The memory of that perfect dance and the cruel disappointment that had followed made Lord Marcus's claim of romantic understanding feel hollow and false. Yet the expectant faces around her suggested that any hesitation on her part would be viewed as foolish ingratitude rather than legitimate emotional reservation about accepting a loveless marriage. "I am deeply honored by your proposal, Lord Marcus," she replied, with the kind of diplomatic precision that allowed her to acknowledge his offer without actually accepting it, "though I hope you will understand that such an important decision requires careful consideration of all the factors involved in creating a successful marriage. Your attentions have indeed been most flattering, and I recognize the advantages that such an alliance would bring to both our families. Yet I find myself hoping for a few days to contemplate the magnitude of what you are proposing before giving you the answer that such a serious matter deserves." Her father's expression suggested that he found even this modest delay unnecessarily dramatic, while Mrs. Whitmore looked positively scandalized at the idea that any sensible young woman would require time to consider such an obviously advantageous proposal. Yet Lord Marcus himself seemed perfectly confident that Cordelia's hesitation represented nothing more than the kind of maidenly modesty that society expected from properly bred young ladies when confronted with offers of marriage. "Of course, my dear," he replied with the patronizing smile of a man who believed himself irresistible to feminine sensibilities. "Such momentous decisions do indeed deserve careful reflection, and I admire your thoughtful approach to matters of such importance. Take all the time you need to accustom yourself to the idea of becoming my wife. Though I confess that my own eagerness makes even a brief delay feel like an eternity when I contemplate the happiness that awaits us both." The conversation might have continued in this vein indefinitely, with Lord Marcus growing increasingly confident, while Cordelia searched desperately for some graceful way to extend her delaying tactics, when the arrival of the afternoon post brought an interruption that changed everything in ways that no one in the drawing-room could have anticipated. The butler approached with his usual dignified bearing, carrying a package wrapped in brown paper and bearing no return address, which he presented to Cordelia with the kind of carefully neutral expression that suggested he had grown accustomed to such mysterious deliveries over the past several weeks. As Cordelia unwrapped the package with trembling fingers, her heart began to race with a mixture of hope and confusion that made it difficult to maintain her composure under the curious gazes of her assembled family and suitor. For within the ordinary brown paper lay something so extraordinary and thoughtful that it could never have originated from the man who had just claimed credit for all her recent musical gifts. The complete piano works of Mozart, bound in the finest leather and printed by the most exclusive music publishers in Vienna, represented not merely an expensive gift, but a treasure that demonstrated such intimate knowledge of her musical preferences and such willingness to spare no expense in procuring the rarest and most beautiful editions available that Cordelia felt her breath catch in her throat with the realization that her mysterious benefactor was still active and still thinking of her happiness with the same exquisite attention to detail that had characterized all his previous offerings. Lord Marcus, observing her reaction to what he assumed was simply another of his own romantic gestures, smirched with satisfied pride at what he interpreted as overwhelming gratitude for his thoughtfulness, completely oblivious to the fact that Cordelia's trembling hands and wide eyes reflected not appreciation for his generosity, but rather the dawning recognition that someone other than the man kneeling beside her chair possessed both the musical sophistication and financial resources necessary to orchestrate the elaborate courtship that had brought such magic into her recent days. Beatrice Whitfield had never been one to shrink from uncomfortable truths or difficult conversations, a quality that had served her well during her own courtship and marriage, but had occasionally made her something of a trial to those family members who preferred to avoid unpleasant realities in favor of more comfortable illusions. Her practical nature had been shaped by years of observing London society with the clear-eyed assessment of someone who understood that romantic fantasies, however appealing, must ultimately give way to the harsh mathematics of social positioning and financial security. Yet watching her younger sister's obvious misery over the past several days had awakened in her a fierce protectiveness that overrode her usual pragmatic caution. She had spent hours analyzing the curious pattern of musical gifts and mysterious serenades that had so delighted Cordelia throughout the season. Noting with the systematic attention of someone trained to manage household accounts the expensive nature of each offering and the sophisticated musical knowledge required to select pieces that would appeal specifically to her sister's refined tastes, rather than the more conventional preferences that satisfied most young ladies of their acquaintance. The timing of each musical encounter had struck Beatrice as suspiciously precise, arriving at moments when Cordelia's spirits most needed lifting, or when her frustration with conventional suitors had reached particularly acute levels, suggesting a level of observation and understanding that required both intimate knowledge of Cordelia's emotional state and the resources necessary to orchestrate such elaborate demonstrations of affection on short notice. More tellingly, Beatrice had begun to notice the presence of certain gentlemen at social gatherings where musical anomalies occurred, particularly the Duke of Ravenshollow, whose reputation for emotional coldness seemed utterly at odds with the passionate romanticism implied by Cordelia's mysterious courtship, yet whose financial resources and social connections would certainly enable him to commission the kind of elaborate musical tributes that had so enchanted her sister throughout the season. The Duke's behavior at social gatherings had also caught Beatrice's attention, particularly his habit of positioning himself where he could observe Cordelia without engaging in direct conversation, his obvious tension during her dances with other partners, and the way his usually controlled expression seemed to soften whenever her face lit with joy at hearing particular musical selections that seemed chosen specifically for her pleasure. When Lord Marcus had claimed credit for the musical gifts, Beatrice had watched the Duke's reaction with the careful attention of someone who understood that genuine emotion was almost impossible to conceal completely, and the flash of rage and devastation that had crossed his features before he regained his customary composure had convinced her that whatever romantic campaign had brought such happiness to her sister was far more complex and dangerous than the simple courtship that Lord Marcus described. Armed with these observations, and driven by her determination to prevent Cordelia from accepting a marriage proposal based on fraudulent claims, Beatrice had decided to confront the Duke directly, calculating that his sense of honor would compel him to reveal the truth if approached by someone who had already deduced the essential facts of his involvement. The morning she chose for this confrontation dawned grey and drizzling, the kind of weather that seemed to match her mood as she prepared to force a confession from a man whose reputation for intimidating lesser mortals was legendary throughout London society, yet her concern for Cordelia's happiness outweighed her natural feminine reluctance to engage in such an aggressive social maneuver. Sebastian received her in his study at Blackwood House with the kind of cold courtesy that he employed to discourage unwanted visitors, his tall frame rigid with the defensive tension that years of emotional conditioning had taught him to adopt whenever he sensed potential threats to his carefully maintained privacy. Yet something in Beatrice's determined expression suggested that this particular conversation would not be easily deflected through his usual methods of aristocratic intimidation. "Lady Whitfield," he said with the precise formality that could make even simple greetings sound like dismissals, "to what do I owe the unexpected pleasure of your visit? I trust that you and your family are well, and that there is no crisis requiring my assistance, though I confess myself puzzled as to what business we might have that could not be conducted through more conventional channels of communication." Beatrice settled herself in the chair across from his desk, with the kind of determined composure that suggested she had no intention of being intimidated by his obvious attempt to establish psychological dominance through formal distance and barely concealed hostility. "Your Grace," she replied with the direct honesty that had always characterized her approach to difficult situations, "I have come to discuss a matter that concerns both your welfare and that of my sister, specifically the elaborate deception that has been perpetrated regarding her recent musical courtship, and the damage that your continued silence may inflict upon two people who deserve far better than the misery that currently defines their daily existence. I know that you are the source of every musical gift and tribute that has brought such joy to Cordelia's recent months, and I know that Lord Marcus Pemberton has stolen credit for expressions of devotion that cost you not only substantial sums of money, but also sleepless nights of planning and desperate hope for some connection with a woman whose happiness has clearly become more important to you than your own emotional safety." Sebastian felt the blood drain from his face as he realized that his carefully guarded secret had been penetrated by someone whose reputation for practical intelligence made denial both pointless and potentially insulting. Yet his instinctive response was still to retreat behind the emotional barriers that had protected him from vulnerability since childhood, rather than admit to feelings that made him feel exposed and defenseless. "I fear you have been misinformed about my involvement in any romantic enterprises, Lady Whitfield," he said with the icy precision that had served him well in business negotiations, but felt hollow and unconvincing even to his own ears. While I naturally wish your sister every happiness in her romantic endeavors, I can assure you that my own interests lie in entirely different directions, and I would consider it highly inappropriate to interfere in courtships being conducted by other gentlemen who possess both the social standing and personal qualities necessary to make Lady Cordelia the kind of husband she deserves. Beatrice leaned forward in her chair with the expression of someone who had expected exactly this response, and come prepared to demolish such weak defenses through the application of irrefutable logic and uncomfortable truth. "Your Grace," she said with the kind of gentle firmness that had made her legendary among London hostesses for her ability to manage difficult guests and awkward social situations, "your denial might be more convincing if you could explain how Lord Marcus, a man whose musical education consists primarily of hunting songs learned at university, and whose financial resources, while respectable, are hardly sufficient to procure the kind of rare manuscripts and elaborate orchestral arrangements that have characterized my sister's mysterious courtship. Furthermore, I have observed your behavior at social gatherings with the attention of someone who understands that genuine emotion is almost impossible to conceal completely, and your obvious tension whenever Cordelia dances with other partners, combined with your careful positioning to observe her reactions to various musical selections, suggests a level of personal investment that extends far beyond polite social interest in the welfare of an acquaintance's sister. She paused to allow these observations to sink in before delivering what she clearly intended as the decisive blow to his remaining defenses. "More importantly, Your Grace, I watched your face when Lord Marcus claimed credit for gifts that you had obviously provided, and the expression of rage and devastation that you could not quite conceal convinced me that whatever noble motives drive your continued silence, they are causing unnecessary suffering for two people who might find happiness together if they could overcome the barriers that fear and social convention have erected between them." Giuseppe Moratini had spent the days following Lord Marcus's public claim of responsibility for the musical tributes, wrestling with a conscience that would no longer allow him to remain silent about a deception that was causing obvious pain to the very people his artistry was meant to serve. His years as a professional musician had taught him to value both discretion and the generous patronage that allowed him to pursue his craft without financial anxiety. Yet watching Lady Cordelia's obvious confusion and distress over the past week had awakened in him the kind of moral discomfort that made continued complicity in Lord Marcus's fraud feel like a betrayal of everything he believed about the sacred relationship between music and truth. The substantial payments he had received from the Duke of Ravenshollow represented more money than he typically earned in an entire season, yet the maestro found himself increasingly troubled by the knowledge that his silence was allowing an innocent young woman to accept the attentions of a man whose claims were built entirely upon lies and theft of another's romantic devotion. Sebastian's passionate instructions about the specific pieces to be performed and the precise emotional effects he hoped to achieve had revealed a depth of feeling and musical understanding that Giuseppe recognized as genuine artistic sensitivity rather than mere wealthy dilettantism, and the musician's professional instincts told him that such authentic emotion deserved better than to be obscured by the machinations of someone who possessed neither the musical knowledge nor the financial resources to have conceived such an elaborate campaign of seduction. The decision to reveal the truth had not come easily, requiring Giuseppe to weigh his professional obligations against his moral convictions, while calculating the potential consequences of betraying the confidence of a patron whose generosity had exceeded anything in his previous experience. Yet the sight of Lady Cordelia's wan face and listless demeanor during her recent public appearances had finally convinced him that continued silence served no one's interests except those of Lord Marcus, whose fraudulent claims were preventing the recognition of genuine devotion that deserved acknowledgement rather than concealment. When he presented himself at Ashworth House on that grey Tuesday morning, Giuseppe carried with him not only the weight of his impending confession, but also physical evidence of the Duke's involvement that would make denial impossible, including bank drafts bearing Sebastian's signature and detailed musical instructions written in his distinctive hand that revealed the extent of his intimate knowledge of Lady Cordelia's preferences and emotional responses to various compositions. The butler who admitted him seemed surprised by the request for a private audience with Lady Cordelia. Yet something in the maestro's serious demeanour suggested that his visit concerned matters of genuine importance rather than mere social courtesy, and Giuseppe found himself ushered into the morning room where Cordelia sat listlessly attempting to read a novel that clearly held no interest for her, while the rain drummed against the windows with the same relentless persistence that seemed to characterize her current emotional state. "Lady Cordelia," he said, after executing the kind of respectful bow that his professional training had perfected over decades of service to aristocratic patrons, "I have come to speak with you about a matter that weighs heavily upon my conscience and concerns the recent musical tributes that have brought such joy to your daily life. And I fear that circumstances have allowed a grave deception to persist that does injustice to both your intelligence and the genuine devotion of someone whose identity has been deliberately concealed from you through a combination of his own excessive modesty and the fraudulent claims of another who seeks to profit from romantic gestures that cost him nothing but shameless lies." Cordelia looked up from her book with the kind of weary attention that suggested she had grown accustomed to disappointment and no longer expected pleasant surprises from unexpected visitors. Yet something in Giuseppe's earnest expression awakened in her a flicker of the curiosity that had been notably absent from her demeanour since the disastrous masquerade ball. "Mr. Moratini," she said with the polite interest that good breeding required even when one's heart was too heavy for genuine enthusiasm, "I confess myself intrigued by your mention of deception, though I hope you will understand that recent events have left me somewhat skeptical about claims concerning mysterious, romantic devotions and their true sources. If you have information that might clarify the confusion that has surrounded my recent musical gifts, I would indeed be grateful to hear whatever truth you might be able to provide." Giuseppe withdrew from his portfolio the bank drafts and written instructions that represented irrefutable proof of Sebastian's involvement, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared to reveal secrets that would either heal or destroy whatever remained of the fragile connection between two people whose happiness had become unexpectedly important to his own peace of mind. "Your ladyship," he said with the grave formality that such a momentous revelation demanded, "every musical tribute that has graced your recent months, from the orchestra that played only Mozart's waltz at Lady Whitmore's soirée, to the street musicians who have serenaded your morning walks, from the rare manuscripts that have appeared at your door to the hidden quartet that provided such magical accompaniment during your family's garden party, all have been commissioned and paid for by His Grace, the Duke of Ravenshollow, whose instructions regarding your musical preferences demonstrated an intimate knowledge of your tastes and an passionate desire to bring joy to your daily life through the language that speaks most clearly to your heart." He spread the documents across the small table beside her chair, allowing her to examine Sebastian's signature and read his detailed specifications about tempo, emotional tone, and the precise effects he hoped to achieve through each musical offering. "These payments, your ladyship, represent sums far beyond anything Lord Marcus could afford, while these instructions reveal a level of musical sophistication and emotional understanding that could only come from someone who has studied your responses with the devoted attention of a man deeply in love, yet too convinced of his own unworthiness to approach you directly with declarations that his damaged heart feared you could never reciprocate." The weight of Giuseppe's revelation settled upon Cordelia's consciousness like a physical force that made it difficult to breathe properly, while her mind struggled to reconcile the image of the cold, intimidating Duke of Ravenshollow with the passionate romantic who had been courting her through the universal language of music for months, without seeking any acknowledgement or reward beyond the simple joy of watching her face light with happiness whenever his carefully chosen melodies reached her ears. Every gift that had brought wonder and delight to her recent days suddenly took on new meaning as she realized that behind each thoughtful gesture lay not the casual generosity of a man seeking to impress her with his wealth, but rather the desperate devotion of someone who understood her soul deeply enough to speak to it through the only medium that could convey the depth of feelings too complex and overwhelming for ordinary words to express adequately. The rare manuscripts that had appeared at her door represented not merely expensive purchases, but treasures selected with the intimate knowledge of someone who had observed her musical preferences with scientific precision, noting which composers brought tears of joy to her eyes, and which pieces made her pause in whatever activity occupied her, to listen with the complete absorption of someone whose entire being resonated with the beauty being offered to her hungry spirit. The street musicians who had seemed to appear by coincidence during her morning walks were revealed as part of an elaborate choreography designed to surround her daily routine with unexpected moments of transcendent beauty, while the hidden quartet at her family's garden party represented the kind of romantic gesture that belonged in fairy tales rather than the prosaic reality of London society, with its emphasis on practical considerations and social positioning over matters of genuine emotional connection. As she examined Sebastian's handwritten instructions to the musicians, Cordelia felt her heart constrict with a mixture of wonder and devastating regret, as she realized that every specification revealed a level of attention to her happiness that went far beyond conventional courtship into the realm of genuine devotion, with detailed notes about the specific emotional effects of different tempos and the careful timing required to enhance rather than intrude upon whatever mood might be affecting her during particular moments of her daily routine. His observations about her responses to various musical selections demonstrated the kind of intimate knowledge that could only be acquired through months of careful study. Yet rather than using this information to manipulate or control her emotional state, he had employed it solely to bring joy and beauty into her existence, without seeking any recognition or gratitude that might have validated his efforts or encouraged him to hope for reciprocation of the feelings that had driven such an elaborate campaign of anonymous devotion. The memory of their masked dance at Lord Fairfax's ball suddenly acquired new dimensions as she realized that the perfect connection she had felt with her mysterious partner had been anything but accidental, representing instead the culmination of Sebastian's long study of her thoughts and preferences that had finally allowed him to approach her as his authentic self, rather than the coldly correct Duke whose social interactions were governed by the rigid emotional control that his brutal upbringing had made second nature. Every word they had exchanged during that magical waltz now revealed layers of meaning that she had missed in her shock at discovering his identity, particularly his comments about seeking someone who valued authenticity over performance, and his obvious understanding of the loneliness that came from being surrounded by people who saw only surface accomplishments while remaining blind to the genuine person who existed beneath the social mask that daily interaction required. Her cruel accusations about his motivations and her precipitous flight from the ballroom now struck her as the worst kind of emotional blindness, revealing her own prejudices about his reputation for coldness, while ignoring the evidence of warmth and sensitivity that had been accumulating around her for months in the form of musical gifts that demonstrated both passionate feeling and exquisite understanding of what would bring her the greatest possible happiness. The realization that she had wounded someone whose devotion had been so complete and selfless that he had never sought credit or recognition for gestures that had transformed her daily existence from tedious social obligation into something approaching magical adventure, filled her with a remorse so intense that she found herself trembling with the need to somehow undo the damage her ignorance and fear had inflicted upon the one person who had seen past her social position to understand and cherish the authentic woman who longed for exactly the kind of connection he had been offering through his elaborate musical courtship. Sebastian's preparation for departure from London had become the focus of all his remaining energy, providing him with practical tasks that offered temporary distraction from the emotional devastation that threatened to overwhelm him whenever he allowed his thoughts to dwell upon the magical evening that had ended so disastrously, or the hopeless future that stretched before him without even the comfort of watching Cordelia's happiness from afar. His instructions to his valet regarding the packing of his personal effects carried the mechanical precision of someone going through familiar motions while his mind remained elsewhere. Focusing on details of travel arrangements and estate business that would require his attention once he retreated to Ravenshollow Castle, where physical distance might eventually dull the sharp edges of a pain that currently made ordinary breathing feel like a conscious effort requiring more strength than he possessed. The decision to abandon London represented not mere tactical retreat, but rather complete surrender of the hope that had sustained him through months of anonymous courtship, the final acknowledgement that his father's lessons about his fundamental unworthiness had been accurate despite the brief period when Cordelia's musical joy had made him believe that love might indeed possess the power to transform even the most damaged soul into something capable of inspiring genuine affection rather than mere social tolerance. The news of Sebastian's grand musical farewell reached Cordelia through her maid, who had heard it from the cook, who had learned it from the butcher's boy, who had been present when the Duke's steward made arrangements for what was being whispered about throughout London as the most extravagant private concert in living memory. The entire Covent Garden Opera House had been hired for a single evening's performance featuring Mozart's complete works, with every seat left empty save one reserved box where an invitation bearing Cordelia's name waited with the kind of elegant script that suggested this would be the final communication she would ever receive. From the man whose anonymous devotion had transformed her understanding of what love might look like when expressed through actions rather than words. The magnitude of such a gesture struck her with the force of revelation as she realized that Sebastian intended this concert not as a romantic overture, but rather as a farewell gift of such breathtaking generosity that it would serve as both apology for whatever pain his deception might have caused and benediction for whatever happiness she might find with the conventional suitor whose fraudulent claims had driven the true source of her musical joy into eggs from the very city that contained everything he apparently valued most in life. Her hands trembling as she read the simple card that accompanied the invitation, Cordelia felt the full weight of her own blindness settling upon her conscience like lead as she understood that her accusations of manipulation and her cruel flight from the masquerade ball had convinced Sebastian that his love was not merely unrequited but actively unwelcome, driving him to plan this elaborate musical farewell as the final gesture of a campaign that had been motivated not by aristocratic arrogance, but by the kind of selfless devotion that sought only her happiness, regardless of the cost to his own emotional well-being. The concert was scheduled to begin at 8 o'clock that very evening, with Sebastian apparently intending to depart London immediately afterward to return to his estates where distance and solitude might eventually heal wounds that proximity to the source of his unrequited passion would only deepen with each passing day. And Cordelia realized with dawning horror that she had perhaps only hours to prevent a catastrophe that would separate them forever, while leaving both to wonder what might have been possible if fear and misunderstanding had not proven more powerful than the connection that music had revealed between their souls. The carriage ride to Covent Garden felt both endless and terrifyingly brief, as Cordelia wrestled with the knowledge that she was about to confront not only Sebastian's feelings, but also her own, including emotions that she had been too proud and too frightened to acknowledge, even to herself during the weeks when his anonymous courtship had filled her days with wonder and her nights with dreams of finding someone who understood the language of her heart well enough to court her through the medium that spoke most directly to everything she valued about beauty and transcendence, and the possibility of genuine connection between two people who shared a passion for something larger than the mundane concerns that seemed to satisfy most of their contemporaries. The opera house stood before her like a temple dedicated to the very art that had brought them together. Its imposing facade lit by torches that cast dancing shadows across the entrance, where liveried footmen waited to escort the single anticipated audience member to her reserved seat. Yet Cordelia found herself hesitating at the threshold, as she realized that whatever happened within those walls would determine not only the immediate future of two people who had been circling each other for months, but also the fundamental direction that the rest of her life would take, depending upon whether courage or cowardice proved stronger when confronted with the possibility of a love that transcended conventional social arrangements in favor of something infinitely more dangerous and potentially more rewarding. The interior of the opera house had been transformed into something approaching a cathedral of music, with hundreds of candles providing illumination that seemed to make the very air shimmer, while the orchestra tuned their instruments in preparation for a performance that would be witnessed by an audience of one, though Cordelia suspected that the true purpose of this evening had nothing to do with her presence, and everything to do with Sebastian's need to express through music the feelings that social convention and personal fear had prevented him from declaring through more conventional means. As she made her way through corridors that echoed with the distant sounds of musical preparation, Cordelia felt her resolution strengthening with each step that brought her closer to a confrontation that would require her to risk everything she had been taught to value about security and social position in favor of pursuing a connection that might lead to either transcendent happiness or devastating disappointment. Yet she knew with increasing certainty that allowing Sebastian to disappear from her life without at least attempting to bridge the misunderstanding that had driven them apart would represent a cowardice that would haunt her for the rest of whatever conventional existence she might construct from the wreckage of this missed opportunity. The moment she entered the main auditorium and saw the orchestra arranged upon the stage, with their instruments gleaming in the candlelight, while hundreds of empty seats waited in silent testimony to the extravagance of a gesture intended for her alone, Cordelia felt her breath catch with the realization that she was witnessing the physical manifestation of a love so complete and generous that it sought to create beauty for her enjoyment without requiring anything in return except the knowledge that somewhere in London a woman who appreciated Mozart would spend one perfect evening surrounded by music that had been chosen specifically to honor everything about her that the giver found worthy of celebration. The sound of a single piano reached Cordelia's ears as she moved through the empty corridors toward the stage, drawn by music that she recognized immediately as Mozart's Waltz in a Minor, played with such heartbreaking emotion that every note seemed to carry the weight of unfulfilled longing and desperate farewell. Following the melody through passages that grew progressively more intimate as she approached its source, Cordelia felt her heart racing with the anticipation of finally confronting the man whose anonymous devotion had taught her more about the nature of genuine love than all the conventional courtships she had endured during her years in London society. Yet she found herself moving with deliberate slowness, as though some part of her understood that whatever words passed between them in the next few minutes would determine whether the story that had begun with a waltz would end in tragedy or transformation. The sight that greeted her as she finally reached the stage area struck her with such powerful emotion that she had to pause in the shadows to compose herself before revealing her presence to the solitary figure seated at the grand piano that dominated the center of the performance space. Sebastian sat with his back to her, his tall frame bent over the keyboard with the kind of complete absorption that suggested he had forgotten everything except the music flowing from beneath his fingers, and Cordelia realized that she was witnessing something infinitely more intimate than any declaration of love she had ever heard spoken aloud. For the passion and pain and desperate hope that infused every note revealed the true depths of feelings that conventional words could never adequately express. His technique possessed the polish of someone who had received the finest musical education that wealth could provide, yet the emotion that drove his performance transcended mere technical accomplishment to become something approaching prayer. As though he were attempting to pour his entire soul into this final musical offering to a woman he believed lost to him forever through his own inadequacy and her understandable preference for more socially acceptable romantic options. The familiar melody that had brought them together during their first magical dance now served as both love song and funeral dirge, carrying within its complex harmonies the entire history of their relationship, from the anonymous courtship that had been his only way of approaching someone he considered too pure for direct contact, to the devastating rejection that had convinced him to abandon London rather than continue hoping for something that his damaged heart had never deserved to receive. As Cordelia stepped from the shadows into the circle of light that surrounded the piano, Sebastian's hands stilled upon the keys as though the music itself had suddenly died within him, and when he turned to face her with eyes that reflected such a mixture of surprise and desperate hope that she felt her own heart contract with the pain of knowing how much suffering her previous harshness had caused someone whose only crime had been loving her with a completeness that her own fears had prevented her from recognizing as the gift it truly was. "Lady Cordelia," he said, his voice carrying the kind of careful control that suggested he was struggling to master emotions that threatened to overwhelm his ability to maintain the social composure that years of ducal training had made automatic. "I had not expected that you would choose to attend this evening's performance, though I confess that having you here makes this farewell infinitely more perfect than I had dared to hope when I arranged for these final musical offerings to be performed in your honor. I hope that you will not find the presumption offensive, for I wished only to create one last opportunity to speak to your heart in the only language that has ever allowed me to express the feelings that conventional words have proven inadequate to convey with the honesty and depth that such emotions deserve, sir." Cordelia moved closer to the piano, with steps that felt both inevitable and terrifying, as she prepared to risk everything upon a declaration that would either heal the wounds that misunderstanding had inflicted upon both their hearts, or confirm that the magical connection she had felt during their masked dance had been nothing more than wishful thinking on the part of two lonely people who had mistaken temporary compatibility for something deeper and more enduring. "Sebastian," she said, allowing herself to use his given name for the first time, while her voice carried the tremor of someone speaking truths that had taken tremendous courage to acknowledge even to herself. "I have come here tonight not to bid you farewell, but rather to confess that my behavior at Lord Fairfax's ball was motivated not by any disappointment in discovering your identity, but by terror at realizing that the perfect connection I had felt with my mysterious partner was real and dangerous and powerful enough to overturn every assumption I had made about what I wanted from life and love. Your reputation for coldness had convinced me that any warmth you might show was merely sophisticated manipulation rather than genuine feeling. Yet Giuseppe Moratini's revelations about your musical campaign have forced me to confront the truth that my own prejudices blinded me to evidence of devotion that has been accumulating around me for months in forms so beautiful and thoughtful, that they could only have originated from someone who understood my soul deeply enough to court it through the medium that speaks most directly to everything I value about beauty and transcendence. She paused, gathering the courage necessary to make the confession that would leave her as vulnerable as Sebastian's musical gifts had left him, then continued with the kind of determined honesty that their relationship deserved despite the risks involved. I have been afraid of loving you, not because you are unworthy, but because your social position and personal magnetism might overwhelm my own identity in ways that would leave me feeling like nothing more than an ornament to enhance your ducal consequence rather than a partner whose thoughts and feelings matter independently of their utility in reflecting glory upon your name and lineage. Yet watching you play just now, seeing the emotion that you pour into music that has no audience except your own need to express feelings too complex for ordinary conversation, I realize that my fears have been based upon society's expectations rather than any evidence of how you actually view me as a person, rather than a prize to be won or a social asset to be acquired. As the echoes of Cordelia's confession faded into the vast silence of the empty opera house, Sebastian felt something fundamental shift within his chest, as though the carefully constructed barriers around his heart were finally crumbling under the pressure of hope that he had thought destroyed forever by her flight from the masquerade and her apparent preference for Lord Marcus's conventional courtship. The sight of her standing beside the piano in a gown of deep blue silk that made her dark hair gleam like mahogany in the candlelight filled him with such overwhelming gratitude for her presence that he found himself struggling to form words adequate to express the transformation that her honesty had wrought upon his understanding of what might still be possible between them, despite the pain and misunderstanding that had driven them apart for so many agonizing weeks. "Cordelia," he said, rising from the piano bench to face her with an expression that revealed every emotion he had been forced to conceal during months of anonymous courtship. "Your words give me hope that I had not dared to entertain. Yet before I allow myself to believe that we might find our way past the fears that have kept us circling each other like wounded creatures, afraid to trust in the possibility of healing, I must tell you the truth about the man you think you might be able to love, despite the damage that years of brutal conditioning have inflicted upon whatever capacity for normal human feeling I once possessed. The musical gifts that brought you such joy were not inspired by any natural romanticism on my part, but rather by desperate need to find some way of touching your heart without risking the direct rejection that my father spent years teaching me was the inevitable result of revealing genuine emotion to another person. And my ability to understand your musical preferences came not from intuitive sympathy, but from obsessive observation driven by the kind of hunger for connection that drives starving men to behaviors that more fortunate people would find incomprehensible. His voice grew rougher as he forced himself to continue with revelations that felt like tearing open carefully healed wounds, yet he knew that any relationship built upon anything less than complete honesty would be doomed to repeat the cycle of misunderstanding and pain that had already caused them both such unnecessary suffering. My father destroyed every expression of joy or beauty that he found in our household, including the music box my dying mother gave me. That played the same waltz we danced to at Lord Fairfax's ball, and he spent my childhood teaching me that love was weakness and sentiment was luxury that no true aristocrat could afford to indulge without losing the respect and obedience that our position in society demands from those beneath us in rank and fortune. I learned to survive by feeling nothing, by viewing every human interaction as a battlefield where victory went to whoever could maintain the most complete emotional control. And even now, Standing here with you in this place where music has allowed us to speak truths that ordinary conversation never permits, I struggle against the voice in my head that insists I am fundamentally unworthy of the kind of happiness that your presence in my life would represent. Sebastian moved to the piano and began playing softly, his fingers finding the melody that had become the soundtrack to their entire relationship, while his voice carried over the music with the kind of vulnerable honesty that years of emotional armor had taught him to suppress. Yet when I watch your face light with joy at hearing Mozart's melodies, when I see you respond to beauty with the kind of genuine emotion that my father tried to beat out of me before I was old enough to understand what was being stolen from my soul, I feel something awakening in the ruins of whatever capacity for love I once possessed, and I begin to believe that perhaps the music box my mother left me was destroyed in body but not in spirit. That the beauty she wanted me to remember still exists in the world and has somehow found expression through my clumsy attempts to bring happiness to someone whose very existence proves that love and beauty are not weaknesses to be crushed, but strengths to be celebrated and cherished and protected from those who would destroy them out of their own spiritual poverty. Cordelia approached the piano as he played, her hands settling upon the keys beside his as she began to play the harmony that complemented his melody with the kind of perfect musical partnership that seemed to symbolize everything they might achieve together. If courage proved stronger than fear, and love more powerful than the social conventions that had kept them apart for so many unnecessary months of loneliness and misunderstanding. Our individual melodies are beautiful, she said, as their hands moved together across the keyboard in a dance that felt both musical and metaphorical. But together, they create something infinitely more complex and satisfying than either could achieve alone, requiring both strength of individual voice and willingness to blend with another in harmony that enhances rather than diminishes what each brings to the partnership. The music they created together filled the empty opera house with sound that seemed to embody every emotion they had been afraid to express directly, from the tentative hope of their first tentative musical exchanges to the passionate intensity of their growing recognition that what existed between them transcended mere attraction or social compatibility to become something approaching the kind of perfect understanding that poets described, but ordinary people rarely experienced outside their most impossible dreams. As the last notes faded into silence, Sebastian turned from the piano to face Cordelia with an expression that revealed the complete transformation that their musical dialogue had wrought upon his understanding of what love might look like when freed from the constraints of fear and social expectation. "Cordelia Ashworth," he said, dropping to one knee beside the piano bench in a gesture that had nothing to do with ducal protocol and everything to do with the genuine humility of someone offering his entire heart to another person without reservation or expectation of anything beyond the honor of being permitted to love her, regardless of whether that love could ever be reciprocated. "I ask you not as the Duke of Ravenshollow to the Earl of Ashworth's daughter, not as a man seeking to enhance his social consequence through an advantageous marriage, but as Sebastian to Cordelia, as one soul who has learned to speak the language of music to another, whose voice harmonizes so perfectly with mine that I cannot imagine creating melodies without the knowledge that you exist somewhere in the world to hear them and understand what I am trying to say through notes and rhythms that carry emotions too complex for ordinary words to express adequately. Will you marry me and allow us to spend our lives creating the kind of harmony together that we have discovered here tonight, building something beautiful and lasting from the individual strengths we each possess, while learning to blend our voices into music that neither could create alone?" His question hung in the candlelit air between them like a musical phrase waiting for resolution. And Cordelia felt her entire future spreading before her like sheet music filled with melodies that only their combined voices could bring to life with the kind of passionate precision that true love required from those brave enough to risk everything upon the possibility that two damaged souls might heal each other through the simple act of choosing harmony over the safety of solitary performance. The morning of their wedding dawned with the kind of perfect spring weather that London rarely provided for its most important social occasions. Yet the gentle sunshine streaming through the tall windows of Ashworth House seemed to illuminate not merely the carefully arranged flowers and elegant preparations, but also the transformation that 3 months of honest courtship had wrought upon two people who had finally learned to trust in the possibility that love might indeed prove stronger than the fears and social conventions that had kept them apart for so many unnecessary weeks of misunderstanding and pain. Cordelia stood before her dressing-table mirror, wearing a gown of ivory silk that had been designed to complement rather than overshadow her natural beauty, the simplicity of its elegant lines reflecting her desire for a wedding that celebrated genuine emotion rather than mere social spectacle. Though the presence of half of London's most prominent families in the drawing rooms below suggested that their union had generated exactly the kind of interest that made privacy impossible even during the most intimate moments of one's life. The month since Sebastian's proposal at Covent Garden had passed like a beautiful dream, punctuated by moments of such perfect happiness that Cordelia sometimes wondered whether she might wake to discover that the entire romance had been nothing more than wishful thinking on the part of a woman who had given up hope of finding the kind of love that transcended conventional social arrangements in favor of something infinitely more meaningful and enduring. Yet the evidence of Sebastian's devotion surrounded her in forms both tangible and emotional. From the daily delivery of flowers accompanied by quotations from her favorite poets to the evening conversations that revealed new layers of compatibility and understanding with each passing day, and she knew with increasing certainty that what they had discovered together represented not romantic fantasy, but rather the genuine connection that had been waiting beneath the surface of their elaborate musical courtship all along. Sebastian's transformation from the coldly remote duke who had once intimidated London society into respectful silence to the warmly attentive fiancé who spent his days planning ways to bring joy to her existence, had become one of the season's most discussed phenomena, with matrons who had previously considered him impossibly unapproachable now sighing over the obvious depth of his devotion, while their daughters mourned the loss of such an eligible bachelor to someone who had somehow managed to penetrate defenses that years of determined social assault had failed to breach. The ceremony itself had been conducted in the intimate setting of the family chapel at Ashworth House, with only immediate family and closest friends present to witness the exchange of vows that spoke not of duty and social obligation, but rather of two souls who had found in each other the harmony that made individual existence feel incomplete by comparison. And when Sebastian placed the wedding ring upon her finger, while promising to love and cherish her for as long as music existed to express the inexpressible, Cordelia felt tears of joy threatening to overwhelm the composure that years of social training had taught her to maintain even during the most emotionally significant moments of her life. The wedding breakfast that followed brought together representatives of London's most distinguished families, many of whom had initially expressed private skepticism about a match that seemed to unite two people whose public personalities had suggested fundamental incompatibility, yet who now found themselves observing a couple whose obvious happiness challenged every assumption they had made about the nature of successful marriages and the possibility of finding genuine love within the constraints of their rigidly structured social world. Giuseppe Moratini had been given the honor of conducting the small orchestra that provided musical accompaniment for the festivities. His gratitude for having played a role in bringing together two people whose love had restored his faith in music's power to heal and connect, expressing itself through performances that transformed even the most conventional wedding selections into something approaching divine inspiration. when the time came for the traditional first dance between bride and groom. The familiar opening notes of Mozart's Waltz in a Minor filled the drawing room with such perfect timing that every guest present seemed to understand that they were witnessing not merely the beginning of a marriage, but rather the continuation of a love story that had been written in musical notation before finding expression through words and promises, and the kind of public commitment that transformed private understanding into social reality. Sebastian led Cordelia on to the small area that had been cleared for dancing with the same reverent care he had shown during their first magical encounter at Lord Fairfax's masquerade. Yet now there was no need for masks or anonymity to protect them from the vulnerability that such perfect connection required. And as they moved together to the melody that had brought them together despite all the barriers that fear and misunderstanding had erected between them, every person present could see that what existed between the Duke and his new Duchess transcended mere attraction or social convenience to become something approaching the kind of perfect harmony that musicians spent lifetimes trying to achieve through careful practice and inspired collaboration. Lord Marcus Pemberton, who had initially greeted news of Sebastian's successful courtship with the kind of wounded pride that defeated suitors typically displayed when forced to acknowledge their romantic failures, had surprised everyone by requesting permission to offer a toast to the newly married couple, and when he rose with his champagne glass and the expression of someone who had finally understood the difference between genuine devotion and mere social ambition, his words carried the ring of authentic good wishes rather than polite convention. "Your Graces," he said with a sincerity that transformed his usually superficial charm into something approaching genuine warmth. "I confess that I spent months believing myself capable of winning Lady Cordelia's affections through conventional romantic gestures, yet observing your courtship has taught me that true love cannot be achieved through any strategy or technique, but rather must grow from the kind of deep understanding that you have demonstrated through your remarkable musical partnership. Your obvious happiness proves that the best marriages unite not merely two individuals, but rather two souls who have discovered that their combined voices create harmonies more beautiful than either could achieve alone, and I wish you decades of the kind of joy that your love has already brought to everyone fortunate enough to witness its development from anonymous admiration to public celebration." The first anniversary of their wedding found Sebastian and Cordelia settled into the comfortable rhythms of married life at Ravenshollow Manor, where the harsh memories that had once made the ancient castle feel like a prison of painful recollections had been gradually transformed through love and music into something approaching the sanctuary that his mother had once hoped it might become for her son when he finally learned to trust in the possibility of happiness rather than merely enduring whatever existence duty demanded of those born to positions of social responsibility. The music room that Sebastian had created during their engagement had become the heart of their domestic life. Its walls lined with rare manuscripts and first editions that represented not merely expensive acquisitions, but rather the shared treasures of two people who had discovered that their individual musical knowledge became infinitely more meaningful when combined through the kind of partnership that enhanced, rather than diminished, what each brought to their collaboration. Evening after evening, they would settle at the twin pianos that dominated the elegant space, their conversations flowing effortlessly from discussions of musical interpretation to shared readings from their favorite poets, to the comfortable silences that only couples who had achieved genuine intimacy could enjoy, without feeling the need to fill every moment with conversation designed to mask uncertainty or maintain social distance. The physical changes that Cordelia's pregnancy had brought to their daily routine had only deepened Sebastian's appreciation for the miraculous nature of the love they had discovered together, and watching her move through their home with the serene grace of a woman who knew herself beloved and cherished had gradually healed wounds in his soul that he had thought too deep for any human agency to reach. Her increasing inability to sit comfortably at the piano for extended periods had led to the development of new musical traditions, with Sebastian often playing while she reclined nearby with whatever book currently held her attention, though more often than not she would find herself simply listening to melodies that seemed to express every emotion that words proved inadequate to convey about the contentment that had replaced the restless longing that had once characterized both their individual existences. The servants who had once moved through Ravenshallow's corridors, with the careful silence of people accustomed to avoiding their master's unpredictable moods, now went about their duties with the relaxed efficiency of a well-run household where kindness and consideration had replaced the fear and tension that Sebastian's father had maintained through deliberate cruelty disguised as aristocratic dignity. Mrs. Henderson, the housekeeper who had served the Blackwood family for nearly 3 decades, had confided to the cook that she had never seen His Grace smile with genuine happiness until Her Grace's presence had transformed the castle from a monument to past sorrows into a home where laughter and music created an atmosphere that made even the most routine domestic tasks feel like privileges rather than burdens. The nursery that was being prepared for their expected child had become Sebastian's special project, with every detail chosen to create an environment that would nurture rather than suppress whatever capacity for joy and beauty their son or daughter might inherit from parents who had learned through painful experience that love was not weakness but rather the greatest strength that human beings could possess when properly understood and courageously expressed. The walls had been painted in soft colors that would provide visual harmony without overwhelming young eyes, while carefully selected toys and books waited to stimulate imagination rather than merely occupy attention, and Sebastian found himself anticipating fatherhood with the kind of eager hope that his own brutal childhood had taught him was dangerous, yet which Cordelia's love had gradually made possible despite years of conditioning designed to prevent exactly such vulnerability to happiness and its potential disappointments. Their correspondence with friends in London brought regular reports of social developments and romantic scandals that seemed to belong to a different world from the peaceful existence they had created at Ravenshollow. Though both Sebastian and Cordelia found themselves grateful for the physical distance that allowed them to maintain connections with people they cared about, while avoiding the kind of constant social obligations that had once made genuine privacy impossible even within the supposed intimacy of their own homes. Edmund Fairfax's letters provided particularly entertaining accounts of the latest matrimonial schemes being pursued by ambitious mothers whose daughters remained disappointingly unengaged despite the conclusion of another social season, while Beatrice's regular visits brought not only sisterly affection but also news of their parents' growing acceptance of a marriage that had initially shocked them with its deviation from conventional expectations about appropriate matches between families of similar social standing. The music box that Sebastian presented to Cordelia on a quiet evening in late autumn represented the culmination of months of secret correspondence with the finest craftsmen in Europe, men whose specialized skills had allowed him to recreate down to the smallest detail the treasure that his father's cruelty had destroyed so many years earlier, yet which had somehow been reborn through love into something even more precious than the original had ever been. The delicate wooden case bore the same intricate marquetry work that had distinguished his mother's gift, while the mechanism inside had been crafted by Swiss artisans, whose reputation for precision ensured that the familiar melody of Mozart's waltz in a minor would ring out with the same crystal clarity that had once comforted a lonely child, and now promised to welcome a new generation into a world where beauty and love were celebrated rather than feared as dangerous temptations that must be crushed before they could weaken the character of those destined for positions of social responsibility. When Sebastian placed the music box in Cordelia's hands, and wound the delicate mechanism that released the first sweet notes of their special waltz into the peaceful atmosphere of their music room. Both felt the profound sense of completion that comes from understanding that love has the power not merely to heal individual wounds, but to transform pain into blessing for those who come after us, ensuring that the mistakes and cruelties of previous generations need not be repeated if courage and compassion prove stronger than fear and the desire for emotional safety that prevents people from risking their hearts in pursuit of connections that might transform ordinary existence into something approaching the transcendent. As the familiar melody filled the space around them, Sebastian drew Cordelia into his arms for the slow dance that had become their private ritual whenever the day's activities gave way to the intimate evening hours that belonged entirely to them. And their movements carried the perfect synchronization of two people who had learned that love, like music, required both individual strength and the willingness to blend their voices into harmonies more beautiful than either could create alone. The music box would eventually find its place in the nursery where their child would grow up, surrounded by the same melody that had once provided comfort to Sebastian during the darkest period of his childhood. Yet now it would serve not as compensation for cruelty and loss, but rather as celebration of the love that had made their family possible, and would guide their son or daughter toward understanding that genuine happiness comes not from avoiding vulnerability, but from learning to trust in the possibility that two people who speak the same language of the heart can create together something infinitely more meaningful than either could achieve through the kind of emotional isolation that masquerades as strength, but actually represents the deepest form of poverty that human beings can inflict upon themselves and those they claim to love. The final notes of the waltz faded into the comfortable silence that surrounded them like a blessing. While outside the windows of Ravenshollow Manor, the winter wind carried the promise of spring and renewal and all the beautiful possibilities that awaited those brave enough to believe that love was not merely a romantic fantasy created by poets and musicians, but rather the fundamental force that gave meaning to human existence and transformed even the most ordinary moments into occasions for gratitude and wonder at the miraculous nature of finding another soul whose voice harmonized so perfectly with one's own that silence became impossible, and every day brought new opportunities for the kind of joy that their younger selves had thought existed only in stories too beautiful to be true.